Madness of Pooh, Book 1, The Boy in the Pink Mist, and so our journey begins. Episode 1, Thomas the Younger, read by Pooh. Standing over his assignment, Pooh let his ethereal fingertips travel ever so slowly and softly across the slumbering boy's bare, perspiring back. "Wakey, wakey," he murmured. The boy shivered and moaned out in a curious purr. "Wake up, lil' darling," Pooh whispered in his effeminate drawl, slow, lazy and soft, yet still compelling, then used a crimson riding crop to tussle the boy's hair, which only caused him to roll to the side and scratch at his head. "Your adventure and despoiling have dawned. Rise, Thomas the Younger. Your master has want of you. Not that shaggy master of yours who barks and growls and I would think is flea-bitten. He can't touch you yet, not until you're turning, which I have to tell you isn't coming. Puberty is not in your future. But never mind that one, as I brought me silver. And most certainly your master is not the weirdo sending his underlings to bring you in for questioning, which is really going to lean heavy on the torture part of extreme interrogation. He's going to be difficult. No, I'm talking about your true master, the Candyman. He's a one-stop shop, makes your cherry pop. He's a sweet-talking, sugar-coated Candyman. He's a one-stop gotcha hot, making all the bloomers drop sweet sugar Candyman. The soul furnace is stoked, serenaded Pooh. Switching to an unsung conspiratorial whisper, Pooh revealed, "He came to me on the night of my britching day. Tatters left my bloomers in, tatters. Oh well, I had to start wearing grony pants anyway. Left me the plantation pansy, he did. Took me but didn't take me with him. Not until later, once I was gone. Tatters didn't like being possessed by Candyman and having to give up his chocolate bar. Got over it though once it sunk in. Hey, I know a pirate chocolatier I can introduce you to. He makes an intoxicating brew, the good Jamaican stuff with a dash of sugarcane rum, a big dash if the captured cabin boys need relaxing. We're going to have such magnificent adventures and long conversations and, hey, do you like sea turtles?" Singing. "He got those lips like sugarcane. Bad things come for boys who wait. Tarzan and Jane were swinging on a vine, sipping from a bottle of vodka double wine. Jane lost her grip and down she fell, squared herself away as she let out a yell. Cheetah, go yow yow! Tarzan and boy were swinging on a vine, sniffing from a bottle of chocolate poppers. Take it while it's hot, baby. Don't stop, yow yow." Pooh waved away his mingled thoughts and whispered to his target, "What kind of candy do you want? Sweet chocolate? That's my favourite. Will be yours too, Jack to be." Stifling a laugh, Pooh whispered, "And I've my own plans for you, laddie. Now wakey wakey." Pooh gave a sly glance towards Thomas, kicked the bed, then faded away to July 11th, 1934, with only the mild scent of sweet honeysuckle left behind. Inhaling the nectar deeply, the boy began waking. Sleepy thoughts, now aroused, danced in his head. Then Thomas the Younger opened his eyes with a gasp, drenched in sweat. September 18th, 1942, his 11th birthday, had dawned. It couldn't have been more than 5 o'clock in the morning. He peered out of the window. Fiery shafts of light were transfixing the sky and plunging into the sea. A leaden silence hung in the already hot air, which Thomas assumed was the cause of his panting. An unnatural silence. But hadn't he heard someone? Thomas scanned the motionless countryside without detecting anything or anyone to explain why he'd woken up so abruptly, why the machine in his head had sounded a sudden alarm, or why he'd darted to the window in 3 swift strides. It was illogical. He should still have been dead to the world. He'd sat up very late rereading the whole of Valentine Williams's Man with the Club Foot, which he liked as much as L.J. Vance's Lone Wolf, if not better, so it had been well past midnight when he went to sleep. Nothing to be seen. He swung his bare legs over the windowsill and sat there with his feet dangling. He was 11 now. Awfully old to have not done much with his life yet. All right, so he was kidding. 11 wasn't that old. He examined the contents of his mind. Nothing wrong there. The machine was functioning smoothly, sifting every detail, scouring the countryside millimetre by millimetre for the smallest detail that wasn't as it should have been. He could trust it not to overlook a thing. He treated himself to a daydream for a moment or two, then climbed back into his bedroom and got dressed. Thomas put on some espadrilles, one of the 120 pairs she'd brought him from Spain 2 years ago, on the last of her surreptitious visits. Not knowing exactly how big his feet were, but foreseeing that he would grow, she'd bought a dozen pairs in each of 10 assorted sizes. He knew perfectly well what he was going to do now, provided everything was as it should be outside. A boy didn't turn 11 every day of the week. It was 2 years since he'd seen the Hispano, which she had obtained directly from the Sukematu family. He always obeyed her standing orders, but today was a special day. She would surely have said yes, especially as she knew that he'd known for the past 4 days that she wouldn't be there on his birthday. He missed her terribly, so much so that he felt quite sick with disappointment. Enough of that, he told himself. Stop it. There was no point at all. Thomas the Elder, Hans Thomas von Goll, died on July 11th, 1934, when he threw himself out of a 5th-floor window in Munich. The only extant photograph of him had been taken without his knowledge by the Gestapo. A tall, distinguished-looking man, whose appearance belied his 70 years, he got into the back of a Mercedes, while a liveried chauffeur, cap in hand, deferentially held the door for him. Visible in the background, a bank in Zurich's Paradeplatz. The photograph predated his death by only 6 days. On July 5th, he was abducted on Swiss soil and spirited off to Germany for questioning. For the first few hours, his interrogators treated him with chill courtesy. An 8th-generation banker, he was on close terms with such influential figures as Gustav Krupp von Bohlen, Fritz Thyssen, Albert Vogler, Georg von Schnitzler, Otto Wolff, and Baron Kurt von Schroeder, the last being a fellow banker from Cologne. The tone of the interrogation changed on July 6th with the arrival on the scene of the fearsome Reinhard Heydrich, recently appointed head of the Sicherheitsdienst, the security service of the Schutzstaffel, Hitler's political soldiers of the Nazi Party. Certain threats were put into effect, but Thomas the Elder stuck to his guns and averred that he had contrived to transfer large sums of capital abroad. He had done so only in compliance with current German legislation and at the express request of his clients. There could, of course, be no question of his disclosing the identity of those clients or the destination of the said funds. What more, the figure of 100 million marks mentioned, or rather bellowed at him by Herr Heydrich, was absurdly widely off the mark. It was ludicrous. No, he insisted, shaking his head at their ignorance of the routine. None of the employees at his bank in Cologne had any knowledge of these transactions. He had done them entirely on his own. He further stated that, having foreseen more than 6 years ago that he might one day find himself in this present predicament, he had made all the requisite arrangements in accordance with a long-matured plan. Of his few surviving close relatives, there were none residing in Germany on whom pressure could be exerted. Herr Heydrich could deprive him of his personal fortune, his bank, even his life, but at his age such things were of little. Thomas the Elder cracked, but only after 110 solid hours of interrogation, throughout which he had been compelled to remain standing stripped to the skin. He was beaten with sundry lengths of rubber hose, mainly on the lower part of the abdomen and the kidneys. For some obscure reason, Reinhard Heydrich was most anxious to know whether or not these beatings resulted in a discharge of blood into the urine, so the old man's interrogators presented him with an enamel bucket after every session. When he pleaded an inability to urinate, they administered 2-litre doses of nearly boiling water down his throat every 4 hours. Eventually, being unable to speak, he consented to write. He was given some paper and permitted to sit down. For nearly 2 hours he churned out columns of names, numbered accounts, and complicated access codes. Then he collapsed from sheer exhaustion. It happened while the 33 scrawled sheets were on their way to Heydrich. Assumed to be semi-conscious, at death's door, and quite incapable of moving, his interrogators left the room. Old Gall sprang to his feet, ran to the window, and launched himself into space. He crashed to the ground 5 floors below, preserving a courageous silence throughout his final descent. It would later dawn on Heydrich that he had been hoodwinked. None of the names listed were authentic. The old banker had concocted a series of fanciful surnames with the aid of the letters composing the words Dummkopf, blockhead, and Unsinn, nonsense, repeated over and over again in acrostic fashion. Worse still, just before he stopped writing and feigned collapse, Hans Thomas von Goll had noted down only a few authentic names complete with brief personal particulars. Those of Adolf Hitler, hysterical house painter, Paul Joseph Goebbels, unsuccessful novelist, Hermann Goering, obese drug addict, Horst Wessel, pimp, Heinrich Himmler, chicken farmer, and Reinhard Heydrich, blonde Jewish fiddler. The very last words he scrawled before committing suicide were, "The exact sum in question amounts to 724 million marks." "Hold on," Pooh muttered to himself as he walked around the splattered body, carefully avoiding stepping into the blood pool so as not to dirty his boots. Threw himself out of a fifth-floor window in Munich, himself! "I did not see that coming," the imp blurted out, laughing. Some among the growing crowd of shocked onlookers stared harshly at Pooh, while others furled their brows in suspicion at the thin, effeminate boy wearing a shiny black skin-tight suit of some type of rubber and sporting glossy pink lips with specks of gold, which matched his fingernails and toenails, if one were to see those, as well as his eyeshadow. The bodysuit was in fact latex, but created using Papaver somniferum, opium poppy. The supernatural processing of the fabric made it nearly indestructible and suited for time travel. The immortal boy's stiletto boots were made of the same latex, though thicker, as was the crimson riding crop he carried. Pooh had styled his uniform from a mannequin he spotted in the window of a fetish shoppy in Copenhagen, sometime in 2012, when he was looking for a certain teen boy hustler he wanted to throttle. Tossing his shoulder-length, blonde highlighted hair to one side, Pooh declared to the crowd, "Hey, I'm not the one who threw his old ass out the window. Yes, I've done that before. Shit happens. Oh, how I long for October 1929. Good times." Looking over at Thomas the Elder, Pooh sang, "Du hast dir einen schönen Zeitpunkt ausgesucht, mich zu verlassen, Lucille. Mit wir hungrigen Kindern und einer Ernte auf dem Feld. Hatte ich einige schlimme Zeiten, habe einige traurige Zeiten durchlebt, aber dieses Mal wird dein Schmerz nicht heilen. You picked a fine time to leave me, Lucille. With 4 hungry children and a crop in the field. I've had some bad times, lived through some sad times, but this time your hurting won't heal." With a theatrical poof, Pooh quickly faded into the time stream, raising a chorus of gasps and screams in his wake. Episode 2. Scent of a Boy. The idea was Reinhard Heydrich's own. In January 1935, at a meeting attended by Goering, Himmler, Gauleiter, Dr. Robert Ley of Cologne, and Hans Frank, the young and brilliant head of the party's legal department, it was decided to set up a Sonderkommand, a special task force, charged with recovering the vast sum by all and any available means. The first code name suggested for this operation was Sesame, but Heydrich preferred Schadelbohrer, literally skull borer, the instrument with which a surgeon pierces the cranium to expose the brain beneath. Thanks to the stupidity of run-of-the-mill Gestapo sleuths, unequal to Thomas the Elder's diabolical cunning, the entire 4 ensuing years were wasted. Inquiries were vigorously pursued in Switzerland, but they came to nothing. The Association of Swiss Bankers had had a 47th article added to the federal banking law, its express purpose being to guarantee their depositors absolute secrecy and thereby thwart any Nazi investigators. In the autumn of 1938, Heydrich furiously instituted a complete reorganization of Schadelbohrer. He entrusted its direction to 2 men whose talents he considered complementary. One was Joachim Gortz, a lawyer specializing in international finance. The other was Gregor Laemmler. Himmler was adamantly against employing Laemmler. It struck him as a bizarre and even decadent idea to enlist the services of a professor of philosophy who wasn't a member of the National Socialist Party, who had no experience with police work, who had evaded military service on the grounds of an alleged cardiac malformation, who had already published rather effete poems and a novel, and whom he, Himmler, detested on sight because of the undisguised insolence that smouldered in the man's yellow eyes. But Heydrich had insisted and taken personal responsibility for the appointment. Gregor Laemmler was an exceptional man, he said. In order to get the better of a wily old fox like Thomas von Gaulle, they needed a fox of equal cunning, and Gregor Laemmler was the most intelligent man in the Third Reich. Our beloved Führer, and ourselves excepted, of course. Heydrich believed what be said, even if he didn't say all be new. He had rescued Gregor Laemmler on 2 separate occasions. Recently from the potential consequences of a disgusting lecture on Nietzsche he delivered to his students at Freiburg University, but more important, earlier by doctoring Laemmler's papers to erase the fact that he had a Jewish grandmother. Such things formed a bond. There was nothing like doing a man a favour to create a kind of permanent affinity and sense of responsibility for him. Heydrich got his way. Gregor Laimler assumed command of Schadelborough in November 1938. At last, the hunt was really on. Thomas the Younger descended the stairs and crossed the halls, tiptoeing in a dead straight line, as if walking an imaginary tightrope suspended across Niagara Falls. He redoubled his precautions while passing the kitchen. He could smell coffee brewing, so Grandpa Allegre must be up already, but he made his exit unheard and unseen. Once outside in the oily, lukewarm residue of the night, so soon to be sucked up by the Mediterranean sun, he skirted a tall thorn hedge smothered in white blossoms and made his way around to the front of the villa. Crossing the terrace, he walked down the palm-fringed drive for 20 yards or so. Although he could see nothing on the road beyond the gates, he had an inexplicable sense that someone was out there. He hesitated. There was another feeling too, one of being leered at, spied on and leered at from different directions. They were just feelings, though, could be just his early waking arousal lingering. Finally, he put on his beret and retraced his steps, convinced that the invisible watcher and voyeur were just figments of his imagination. He returned to the rear of the house, where the rose beds had been replaced by a kitchen garden in conformity with wartime restrictions, just as the tennis court was now occupied by a henhouse. "Down! Adolf!" Adolf was the dog employed to guard the hens. There was no love lost between Thomas and Adolf, but they tolerated each other, and at least the sly animal didn't bark. It followed the boy's progress with a mobile eye, muzzle resting on 4 paws, body motionless, as he slipped through the shrubbery. A cross between a Pyrenean sheepdog and something, Adolf tipped the scales at 100 pounds and loathed everyone in the world except Grandma Allegre, to whom the stupid mutt was insanely devoted. Beyond the shrubbery lay a rough track and a dry-laid stone wall. Thomas made for the shelter of the pine woods. He didn't turn around till he'd gone a couple of 100 yards. He was already higher than the villa's roof, and at this altitude the view was unobstructed. He could make out the cove of Portis Sol, Ban Rouge Point, a stretch of the road from Sanary, and the sea as far as the Embiez archipelago. Still nothing untoward, no strangers to be seen from his vantage point. He set off again and climbed higher, expecting any moment to feel the sun hit him in the back as it rose from the sea. Instead, just as he reached the white rocks at the summit, he sensed a strong human presence. Thomas owed the sensation to what she had one day laughingly called his wolf's instinct. He focused his gaze on a pine tree somewhat bigger than the rest, 20 yards away to his right. Positive that there was someone concealed behind it, he took another 3 steps. The man came into view, leaning against the trunk with a spuriously casual air, an immensely tall, dark-haired man with a big hooked nose and lugubrious face. One of his huge, gnarled hands, the left one, had lost the little finger and the ring finger. He wore a cap and a black leather jacket, and cradled in his arms was a rifle. Reinhard Heydrich had been right. Within a very few months, Gregor Laimler and Joachim Gortz were on the right track. Gortz had managed to reconstruct the old Cologne bankers' manoeuvre in its entirety. Thomas the Elder had not been content merely to salt away the enormous sums entrusted to him in Swiss banks. Foreseeing that Switzerland's neutrality might not be respected if war broke out, he had transferred the money to the other side of the Atlantic, either via Switzerland or by other routes, and deposited the bulk of it in the United States. Better still, the old fox had allowed for the possibility that the authorities in Washington might, in the event of a generalized conflict, invoke the terms of the Enemy Act and block all foreign assets. Gortz was well aware that others had been just as far-sighted, notably the Dutch investment firm of Philips. He even became convinced that Gaul had copied the Dutch, if not anticipated them. The old man would have deposited everything in America, not in ordinary accounts, but with investment trusts, doubtless in the highly accommodating state of Delaware, institutions whose structure would enable them to escape the Enemy Act if it was applied. Although they were officially administered by American nationals, the true ownership of these companies was defined by highly secret trust deeds. Gortz thought it more than probable that Gaul had gained entire control of these trust funds before his death, that he was the general trustee of the whole extraordinary financial complex. But how would he then be reimbursed? Here again, Gortz thought he knew the answer. A Herr Müller or Herr Bernstein, who had entrusted the banker with, say, 500,000 marks, would undoubtedly have received precise instructions. Once outside Germany, the said gentlemen were to travel to Montreal, Mexico City, or Panama, anywhere in fact. There, by coupling their request with a certain access code, they would be issued a false passport belonging to a non-belligerent country, instructed to present themselves at a given bank, and repaid their money in full, complete with interest, either in US dollars or in the currency of their choice, at any place on earth that suited them. Gortz, being a true professional himself, not only admired this high-precision system, but obtained confirmation that his theories about it were correct. Gregor Laemmler, the former professor of philosophy from Freiburg University, turned out to be a formidable manhunter. He unmasked 6 of Thomas von Goll's mysterious clients, only 2 of whom were Jews. 4 of them were induced to reveal the system whereby the transferred funds could be retrieved. In March, Gortz travelled to Philadelphia in America, and from there he visited Montreal, Toronto, and Mexico City. Equipped with 4 sets of fake papers and the access codes of the 4 detainees, who had been tortured into revealing them, he passed himself off as the owner of each deposit account in turn. The result was identical in every case. The poker-faced lawyers or bankers he approached would request a 48-hour delay, then confront him with the same icy response. What money? They had no idea what funds he was referring to. Who was this Herr von Gall or Müller or Bernstein on whose behalf they were alleged to be holding such a sum? As far as they were concerned, the secret codes produced by Gortz meant absolutely nothing. Gortz was undeceived by these denials, especially after being compelled to wait for 2 days each time. He realised that although he had managed to pick nearly every lock in Gall's security system, he was ignorant of the final barrier, thus temporarily unable to breach it. He returned to Germany early in May. Reviewing his hand on board the Harpag steamship Hamburg, he discovered that it contained only one remaining trump, a high card, but extremely difficult to play. Thomas the Elder, who had thought of everything, must necessarily have made allowance for his own death, natural or not, and thus for his replacement as trustee. He would surely have nominated one or more persons to succeed him. These residuary trustees, as they were known, might be anyone and anywhere in the world. Although their identification would have solved everything, it seemed an altogether impossible task. It was not until he landed ashore that Gortz heard the news. His peculiar colleague Gregor Laemmler had, in fact, achieved the impossible. He knew the identity of Thomas the Elder's successor. "Buenos dias, Javier," shouted Thomas the Younger. "Hola, ¿qué tal?" said the man with the rifle and the leather jacket. "Buenos dias, Miguel," said Thomas to another man on his left, who was so effectively concealed that only the toe of one shoe and the tip of his rifle barrel could be seen. "Hola, buenos dias, niño bonito," replied Miguel the Invisible. Neither of the 2 lookouts had budged an inch. Thomas passed between them and breasted the summit of the hill. As he moved past Miguel, he felt a sudden stirring of submission, causing him to glance downward to avoid the wolfish man's eyes, yet making sure Miguel got a good look at his presented behind. The sun appeared, bathing everything in a dull white glow. He turned for a last look at the ochre villa. It was well below him now, and the view had expanded still more to include Creed Point, Bandol, and the Embiez Islands. Thomas briefly debated whether or not to tell Javier about the funny sensations he'd had since waking up. He decided against it. Javier Cole could be relied on not to miss a trick. Nothing ever escaped his notice, including the almost undetectable pheromonal scent Miguel had released as Thomas approached them, causing the boy to show natural submission and present his backside to the potential mate. Javier and Miguel were already on the alert with their rifles ready for use. Tomeo and Juan would not be far away. Thomas made his way along the undulating crest for a while, the distance helping him to regain control of his senses and vanquish Miguel's voiceless invitation to copulate. He was too young anyway, with his time not yet come. Plus, Miguel would have a hard time getting by Javier for Thomas's first mount. As pack leader, it would be Javier who chose breeding pairs, and with his being a boy with a noticeable attraction towards the same sex, he'd likely be given to an old one, whose mate had died, yet still desired intimate comfort. Ordinarily, Miguel should be seeking a female to carry his seed line, yet it was clear his hunger was for something else. In any case, he had guard duty to perform. Protection overrode all desires to breed, even unnatural ones. Had it been any other morning, say yesterday, and Javier had been away, and Thomas found himself alone with Miguel, well, making babies isn't always the goal in coupling. Allowances could be made. The idea made the boy smile as he walked away from the men. These new cravings were confusing. Something had come to him as he slumbered. An awakening was seeded in him by someone in the shadows of his dreams. It had been occurring for a week now. His desires weren't too big, but they were nudged into existence, and his curiosity was growing. Fascination was evolving into longing. The sun continued to climb behind his back, as if he hadn't been heated up enough already. The dry heat became more intense with each step. The little soil that clung to the white rocks was baked to the semblance of fine ash after so many weeks without rain. The brooding silence was such that the smallest twig snapped beneath his feet with a sound like splintering bone. He came to an expanse of open ground studded with metallic-looking thistles. Facing him stood a cottage, but he ignored it and headed for the rock face on the left. Biting into the rock was a big double door made of ill-fitting planks, bleached grey by the elements and veined with black. The bolt was secured by a padlock that would have sprung open if a dragonfly had landed on it. Thomas peered cautiously in all directions, then pried the two halves of the door apart and squeezed inside, taking care not to collide with the dusty, wicker-covered wine demijohns that lined the wall. He threaded his way between the cobwebs until he came to the far end. There, after pausing for thought, he deftly inserted his hand into a cavity in the rock and exerted downward pressure. With a faint click, the rear wall slid aside. The car was still there, nesting like a jewel in the man-made grotto it had taken weeks to hew from the living rock. Thomas depressed a switch, and a naked bulb revealed it in all of its incredible splendour. It was a Hispano-Suiza J12 Coupe Type 68A with coachwork by the Levallois-Perret company, Franet, near the prosperous northwest edge of Paris, and boasted a 13-foot wheelbase. The colour scheme was silver grey and black. The superb stylised stalk surmounting the radiator cap was cast in solid silver. Everything about the vehicle scintillated and shone. Even in the semi-darkness, it seemed to have a life of its own. The echoes of Tugger travelled through the pink mist surrounding Pooh as he observed Thomas. "Tugs, I hear you. I know you survived, but at great cost to me, and that cost was paid to the demon horde by giving them you. So, have some consideration for me. I just refuse to acknowledge you anymore. Go play with that tentacled fiend you're subjugated to," the immortal boy thought to himself, knowing the depravities Tugger suffered in the pit could not be more agonising. The imp knew the pit was far worse than, say, Delicatus and his intoxicated sea turtle frenzies, and creepier than the banana slug fetish the nipper had gotten axolotl and songbird into, and Dickie's cheese hoarding, and Sugar Baby's constant flow of silver-haired gentleman callers in that London flat he didn't know Pooh knew about. Those quickly drawn-up wills and dried-up bodies were drawing attention from the coppers. Out loud, Pooh uttered, "Shiver me timbers, and they call me the degenerate one. Those younger boys are getting out of line. They need a strong hand on their wee fannies. Maybe some cocklet cages and plugs for those brats are in order. Alexa, add the following to my shopping list. 1 dozen chastity devices in small sizes. 1 dozen. Tugger's echoes persisted, making Pooh think that the tentacles had all been tended to for the time being by his old swain, who now had time for mischief. Pooh surrendered and listened deep into the pink mist, while still maintaining his sense of disinterest. "Do you share that shoop, that kiss with your poisonous lipstick, Pooh? Your mortal child-killing trademark, your fucking mind seductions? Boys, oh you cursed boys, were your sins your own or someone else's? The flesh pleasures, the body pains, the confusion, the lostness. Pooh gives you not a gift and redemption, but a curse and damnation," Tugger hissed. Now growling in his distorted voice, the pit demon playmate revealed, "The imp is a twisted temptation in the wilderness of time, leading you to further harm. Beware his caresses of mind, body and soul. His sleep touches on your heated, slumbering bodies wakens your desires, yet those touches are from a claw. Imagine a pleasure in which the moment of satisfaction is simultaneous with the moment of destruction. To kiss is to poison, lifting to your lips this face after which you have ached, dreamed, longed for. The face shatters every time. Those hopeful, tender, loving, arousing dreams are truly just disguised nightmares. Oh, how I ponder you, Pooh. Your forgotten and discarded tugger has never been far behind you. I coexist within your mist, my demise in air. I hear you calling me in your slumber, your longing voice paining me with needles and pins. I want to hurt you just to hear you screaming my name. Don't want to touch you, but you're under my skin, so very deeply under my skin. Yet I want to kiss you, but your lips are venomous poison, even for a demon. You're a beauty that must die, and an empty joy, whose hand is ever at my lips in bidding adieu, an aching pleasure nigh, turning to poison while the bee-mouths sip my sweet nectar away. Dead. The words fall from my tongue and linger there like a haunt hanging from my lips. I shake the thought away and swallow, but I can still taste the remnants of you, bile in the back of my throat. It's sour, and I gag a little as tears swell behind my eyes. Your boys have no idea to where you lead them, you eternally damned bedlamite. And the bard did say, I will kiss thy lips. Haply, some poison yet doth hang on them. Tugger's final words faded, as Pooh was swept deep into the pink mist of time. He knew how to exit, when the demon concubine got too melodramatic and annoying. Pff! Time for a different mission with the crew. Perhaps a shag with the twins. Right, make my hair stand on end thinking how those two castrato forget all about their masses and vows and act like harlots with a shiny nickel. Do they even take vows? Or is it just snip snip, go sing, go get funky with the priests? I don't care. Tit and tat I beckon thee. Enter the mist, boys, he ordered. As the voice of Pooh drew them to his side and away from 1969, Agent Tit and Agent Tat were sucked half-naked from Crivon's Kirch studio near the Black Sea, not far from where Thomas was now, but 27 years apart time-wise. Within the mist, Pooh saw that Laurent and Louis, Tit and Tat, were dolled up in black thigh-high stockings, garter belts and butt-revealing thongs. Their short blonde hair was combed straight, lips and cheeks rose-coloured. Holding hands, the two suddenly bashful 14-year-old brothers closed in tight, pressing their smooth, lean bodies against each other for comfort. Born Laurent Alain Moreau and Louis-Jules Moreau on May 5th, 1555 in Orléans, France, the inseparable identical twin brothers had had a good 14-year run from infancy to adolescence in service to their family and church, before Pooh showed up and manipulated them into castrating Pope Pius V, which caused the trio to take flight from Rome. The boy from the pink mist and the 3 mercenary Turks he'd brought in as muscle for the mission then took liberties with the pair before strangling them and dumping their bodies into a canal in Venice. In the afterlife, when they aren't singing soprano and reciting prayers, they enjoy posing for risque photographs for pocket money, tending to the Isles kennels and slitting the throats of clerics. Their shape-shifting abilities developed just over 100 years ago. A Moreau family descendant had some fun with them on an island in the South Pacific, never imagining what his experiments would achieve with a couple of visiting immortal kin into things like vivisection. Their body parts would naturally regenerate, resulting in all kinds of unique splicing ventures. The boys wanted their testicles back, which is why they'd sought out their mad scientist relative. But as that loss happened pre-death, it wasn't a possibility. While living, they'd been castrated well before puberty. The mortal body mutilation would forever be with them. At the living age of 9, Laurent and Louis were sold by their highly devout Catholic family to a man enamoured with their sweet voices and boy beauty. He had them castrated and provided singing lessons. Their lack of testosterone meant that the singers' bones didn't harden, so their bones grew unusually long and their rib cages expanded, giving them a vast amount of breath capacity, allowing them to enrapture audiences by holding notes for a superhuman amount of time, as well as singing higher than a naturally matured male voice could. They remained hairless and lean. Soon, they had prominent roles in operas, churches, and courts across Europe, where they entertained audiences from the stage and showed benefactors their appreciation in private chambers. The twins had enjoyed being experimented on and accommodating various species, so much so that Pooh had to drag them out off Moreau's Island after 2 years and get them back to work conducting assassinations. "Those black satin ribbon chokers with bells are a nice touch," admired Pooh as he stroked Tat's neck. "Well, at least that pederast didn't have you in short togas with your fannies hanging out and feeding grapes to that hairy dwarf again. Hated that fucker. Now, I like Crivon. We have a professional appreciation for each other. He's got a great taste in boys, and that silver tongue of his, along with some cash, has gotten many a lad to drop their drawers, but his weird sidekicks bug me all to hell. Did you know that little arsehole gave Tatters diarrhea? What a mess. You ought to have seen Agent Songbird try to put a diaper on that hulk, while complaining about not feeding hairy dwarfs to zombies, like there's a written rule about it or something. Don't want to get fed to Tatters, then don't grab my arse with those stubby fingers. Here I thought it was Bam Bam getting frisky. Turned around and looked down to see that scrunchy mug. Ew. Never again. Not since Agent Bobber and I were waiting around at the Texas State Fair midway for the Tilt-A-Whirl calamity and got sidetracked. Carny dwarfs are the worst. I hope the new photos come out nice and the American postal inspectors don't catch them. Uptight bastards. You got the cash up front this time, right? I'm liking this look, though, Pooh said to them. How about a little pit stop? We'll all need to change clothes anyway. I can put on a cassock if it gets you in the mood. I think I washed the blood out. Has like 30 holes from where I stabbed Father Torres. Drink the last of the tequila, and you get stabbed. Now that's a written rule, like it rubs the lotion on its skin, or else it gets the hose again, or men don't make passes at girls who wear glasses. Real rules. Ready to make a Pooh sandwich? Tit and Tat giggled in unison. Okay, just let me set the recorder on Thomas. Oh damn, he'll be on a train. Love trains, bouncy, bouncy. We'll catch up with Gacy later. He was to be the mission. A little sidetrack from the tween, but I'm in no rush to deal with clowns right now. James's body will keep in that crawl space. Besides, my old pal Rick needs some company in there. As the trio exited the mist and entered the spacious chambers their commander occupied on the Isle, Tit and Tat cozied up to Pooh. Jumping on the bed, Pooh directed, Tit, you get the side with the wet spot, that fucking bat. Alexa, play Tom Jones on shuffle. Leering at the twins, Pooh unzipped the front of his catsuit and sang, What's new, pussycat? Whoa, whoa. Gregor Laimler, a little man with sandy hair, felt sure he was on the right track. This certainty stemmed not only from his deductive powers, but also from his burgeoning hunter's instinct, an instinct which was developing into a positive lust for the chase. He was convinced beyond all doubt that the residuary trustee, to borrow Gortz's jargon, was a woman named Maria Weber. Episode 3. Jonas, the Free Spirit. Corden came down from the tree line and made his way, purposefully now, along the rutted track which led to the farm. He had stashed his car carefully behind a little copse of apple trees which were starting to brim with young fruit. For some minutes, he had taken cover there himself and watched through binoculars for movement around the farm buildings. There was no sign of life, except that a wisp of smoke waved lazily from the chimney of the main dwelling as if beckoning him. He thought about this for a moment, but was not anxious. The heat of the late summer had already begun to be met by a definite chill in the air. He swept his glasses round and surveyed the countryside, concentrating on the narrow loops of road that wound up and down the surrounding hills. He was content. He had taken all the usual precautions, his principle being, as always, to prepare thoroughly and once prepared, to abandon oneself to whatever it was that lay ahead. He placed the binoculars in the pocket of his overalls and stood there, thinking. From the high ground, he could vaguely make out the town of Adorf, some miles in the distance. He also gave particular attention to the small dairy herd a few fields away, and briefly wondered how Rudy Wagner managed to provide for his young family. Collectivization was hitting smallholders hard, and Rudy only managed to scrape by with the little bit of private enterprise that his good standing in the Farmers' Party allowed him to get away with. Corden's mind flashed momentarily back to his own rural childhood, and the relative abundance he had enjoyed, the richness of the produce, the magnificent herd of Jersey cows his own father had owned. He had grown up as Thomas Eric de Barnier Cordon, the exotic part of his name, due to a distant strain of French aristocracy on his mother's side. But here he was, Gunther Ehrlich, at least for the duration of his visit. He forced himself to adopt a casual, tired gait, even as his concentration on the farmhouse intensified as he approached. He swung an empty jerrycan in his right hand. He had made a point of bringing it from the car, and now used it as a prop, letting it be seen, on the understanding that he would be observed. When he reached the large wooden door, he stopped as if suddenly unsure of himself. He made a show of looking about for signs of life before knocking timidly, then again, more boldly. He cleared his throat and waited, wondering if Rudy was watching him from some hidden vantage. He had recruited Rudy in '63 and run him more or less without incident for nearly 2 years now. His value was his access to economic intelligence as a trusted member of the local party hierarchy. He had produced some decent results over the last 18 months. Nothing spectacular, nothing, to be honest, of any great importance, but good, solid, reliable information. Enough, just about enough to keep Corden engaged. His last couple of reports had even been acknowledged in London as having provided potentially significant insights into the restructuring of East Germany's agricultural planning. They had sent Corden back to ask for more. But that was over 6 months ago, and in the end, the intelligence had come to not very much after all. Most of it had eventually been picked up and reported on in the local party newspaper, a fact that Corden had cursed, regretting the payment he had secured for Rudy and London's subsequent displeasure at having the paid-for goods made so freely available. When the door finally opened, Corden was surprised to see Jonas and Johann standing doubtfully in front of him. He wasn't sure that they would recognise him. It had, after all, been many months since they had last seen him, and then only briefly, fleetingly, from a distance, as he chatted with Rudy. They looked at him with a kind of awe. "Is your father in?" asked Corden. They looked at each other before Jonas shook his head. "I had some trouble with my car. I broke down, well, not broke down exactly, but I'm very close to running out of petrol. I was hoping I could buy some from you, from your father. I'll pay a good price, just enough to get me going again." He had prepared this cover story as a routine precaution against a nosy neighbour, against anyone who might be suspicious of his sudden, unannounced arrival. "Can I come in?" he asked with an encouraging smile, raising the jerrycan to shoulder height and turning it slightly in his hand, pantomiming its emptiness. He was rather self-conscious of his accented German. He had first encountered the language as a 10-year-old during the war, when a pair of twins, Jewish refugees smuggled out of Berlin, were billeted at his family farm in North Devon. They were far enough away from the bombs that fell on Plymouth and Exeter, and to him the war was a long, fantastical adventure, made stranger still by the presence of Ruth and David. Over nearly 3 years, they had taught him to speak German, and to an attentive listener, he was sure, the clipped drawl of their Berliner style of speech was still evident in his short vowels and over-enunciated consonants. The boys looked at each other again. They were very alike in some ways, blonde and fine-featured, although Jonas at 12 was leaner and somehow darker, more intense and ashen. Johann, 2 years younger, was still round with puppy fat, his features alert and eager, his eyes bright and confiding. Jonas already had a reserve, was already set apart in his own mind, and withheld himself accordingly. Neither spoke, but they moved aside, rather grudgingly, to allow Corden to enter. He moved swiftly to the centre of the large living room and looked about, trying to sense a presence in one of the other rooms. The kitchen maybe, or at the top of the rough wooden staircase, if not Rudy, then Anna. His gaze finally took in the big open hearth, where a badly constructed fire was dying slowly. "Are you alone?" he asked. Again neither boy spoke. Johann regarded him keenly, a rather excited glint in his eyes, a flush to his cheek. Jonas, by contrast, looked positively hostile. He reached out a hand and pulled his younger brother back towards him. Johann, in his eagerness, had taken an involuntary step towards Corden, but was now drawn back into the protective orbit of the older boy. Both were dressed alike in worn T-shirts, faded cartoon bears, advertising a popular fizzy drink, and very short, tight running shorts, which clung around the tops of their pale legs. Both were barefoot, and looked pretty filthy and in need of a bath. "Do you remember me?" Corden said. Gunther Ehrlich. I'm a friend of your father's." Corden spoke his assumed name loud enough for anyone listening upstairs to hear it clearly, but still there was no response. Rather at a loss now, he could only think to try and prompt the boys into answering him, although he didn't truly expect he would get anywhere. "The harvest should be good this year," he said casually, and waited for a response. For a few seconds, he was very aware of the large ticking of an elaborately framed clock on the wall to his right. Then Jonas spoke. "That's what the experts say," he said in a quiet monotone. Corden looked at him carefully. "The only expert I trust is my grandma," he replied, and waited as the clock boomed out a thunderous quarter hour. "Me too!" exclaimed Johann, with a sudden shy grin and a little windmilling of his arms. "I only trust my grandma too!" This odd exchange was one of half a dozen word codes that Corden had insisted Rudy learn by heart to be used to establish the security of a meeting. Any deviation from the agreed wording would signal that something was up. Rudy had complained about the whole rigmarole and mocked the stupid, supposedly innocuous phrases that they had come up with, but Corden had insisted, and finally Rudy had acquiesced. Corden was somewhat alarmed to discover that Rudy had entrusted his sons with this much information at least, and he wondered vaguely how much they actually knew and understood about his relationship with their father. He was also aware that Johann's final response had not been word perfect, but on balance, he considered it close enough. "So, are you alone? Where's your father? Is Mummy here?" The brothers exchanged a quick glance before Jonas finally opened up. "Our mother is out. She took the car to a Dorf. It's market day. She won't be back for ages. I'm in charge." "And your dad?" "Daddy's gone," blurted out Johann. Jonas shushed him urgently, showing that he was indeed in charge. "No, he's not," he said lamely, and blushed at the lie, suddenly looking more like his younger brother than he would have cared to admit. "You knew what to say. About the harvest. About only trusting Grandma. I'm impressed. Your father must have taught you that. Do you know what it means? Why we say it?" Both boys looked anxiously about them, suddenly serious and a little scared. Corden sensed their immediate reluctance, but also, behind that, their ultimate desire to engage with him. He saw for an instant just how beautiful they were, poised like that between suspicion and trust. They shone in his eyes, bright and fierce, like wild animals, their little bodies radiating energy. They gave off a natural, unmediated animal energy like a pungent stink, which ignited something in his soul. So even whilst his gaze was both drawn to and repelled by the dirtiness of their exterior, the ragged, smelly clothes, the soiled, quivering bodies, his feelings were engaged most of all by their eager, animal alertness, the curious delicacy of their connection, the boyish solidarity that they affected in front of him. They had no reason to trust him after all, and whatever was said in answer to his question would, he knew, fall short of real trust. But in the end, the allure of their sheer otherness was irresistible to him. He smiled, kindly. "It's in case anyone's listening," said Jonas carefully. Swallowing hard, he put an arm around his brother's shoulders. Corden didn't want to alarm the boys. He didn't want to put ideas into their heads. He decided to play it very long and not press them, but he was desperately worried. Rudy should have been here, and it was troubling to think that he had disappeared. He was thinking hard. There could be any number of perfectly innocent explanations, but just if he had been picked up, his thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a vehicle pulling onto the parched, scrubby grass at the front of the farmhouse. All three of them froze. Corden edged sideways to the large window, across which was drawn a pair of thick plastic curtains, red with garish yellow flowers. He watched carefully for a few seconds, his body taut and uncertain. Then he visibly relaxed. He turned to Jonas and addressed him most conversationally. "Why lie to me? You must know that market day in Adorf is tomorrow. Why the lie?" He scrutinized the lad, genuinely perplexed. "It's your mother, by the way." Both boys skipped on the spot and made for the door. Corden held them back with a quick gesture. "Don't lie to me again. It's important. Your dad wouldn't like it for one thing. I expect he'd warm your backside if I told him." Jonas flushed very prettily, took a big lungful of air and pouted, but didn't argue, his sudden reluctance a kind of admission to Corden's thinking that his speculation was, indeed, correct. Johann was smiling broadly, relishing in his mind a particularly pleasing scenario that involved his beloved elder brother being warmed very thoroughly. At the same moment, Anna walked in and did an almost comical double-take at seeing the three of them together. "Gunther!" she exclaimed, somewhat shocked. She recovered her poise quickly enough and greeted Corden with a warm embrace, kissing him lightly on both cheeks. "You can't stop here. You mustn't," she whispered urgently. It was only then that she looked properly at her children and turned briefly to the door again, as if uncertain what to do. "What a state you two are in," she said finally. "Jonas, go and put some water on to boil. Make sure the kettle's full, and bring in a pail of cold as well. Johan, you can fetch the tin bath. It's in the scullery. Bring it in here in front of the fire." She gazed for a moment at the dying fire, its uselessness despite the boy's best intentions. She smiled almost to herself, and was actually laughing when she turned to Corden. "Go on, hurry up. I need to talk to your Uncle Gunther." "Are you going to give us a bath, now?" asked Jonas. He screwed up his face and looked at Johan, slightly aghast, but also somewhat sly and emboldened. "Enough of that. Just do as you're told," scolded Anna, laughing all the time as the boys skipped out reluctantly to fulfill their allotted tasks. She was instantly more serious when she turned again to Corden. She was young still, barely into her mid-30s, a good 10 years younger than her husband, and nearly 5 years younger than Corden himself. Her face was narrow and prematurely lined. Her hair was long and yellow and tied back in a bunch, which would have made her look like a teenager had her skin been better. Her children had both inherited her blue eyes and wild hair, although Johan definitely had his father's nose, wide jaw and prominent ears, so that for all the brothers had in common, Jonas was most like Anna. She was a woman with very little vanity, a free spirit, full of laughter but capable of sober reflection and an unswerving obedience to a moral code she neither wanted nor expected others to share. In this, too, Jonas was like her, something he had become aware of only recently. It was a similarity of outlook that he treasured secretly as representative of their most private bond, unique and unbreakable. Most important of all, it was something beyond the scope of his younger brother's still childish understanding. Even when she scolded him or punished him, he approved of her damning words or actions and was content to hold himself accountable to her and her alone. He loved his father and was lavish with his attention when Rudy was around, but he was somewhat condescending to him. Always a slight, disdainful smile lit up his face when his father spoke. He would watch him at work with frank curiosity, finding him amusing and worthy only of his merry sarcasm. The hidings he sometimes received as a result were more to be celebrated, he thought, than endured, and made him a hero in Johan's eyes, and strangely, in Anna's too. It was only if she took the belt to him that he was truly penitent, leading him to gulp in shame as he lowered his trousers for her. Anna took a pace towards Corden, and in a very typical gesture, she placed the palm of her right hand against his cheek and held it there momentarily. They had never been lovers, but the frisson of possibility had always been there, almost from the start. "Where's Rudy?" asked Corden. She looked at him piercingly. "Did he ask you to come here?" she said, avoiding his question. "Did he set up a meeting, or was it you?" She was gazing past him slightly, and Corden suddenly had the feeling that this question was very important to her, that a lot might rest on his answer. He decided to tell the truth. "Rudy made contact. He said he'd be here. Everything seemed in order." "Made contact how?" "Here." Corden hesitated. He trusted Anna, but knew that there were times when Rudy shared with her details of his secret life to a greater degree than Corden felt necessary or desirable. But Corden had never been married, and he knew how forthright and persuasive Anna could be, especially perhaps as a wife. "In a safe way. A very secure way. I don't think it was compromised." Anna laughed and flashed him a wide-eyed smile. "That, my dear Gunther, is a very good answer. A very safe answer. A very secure answer." She paused, taking a long breath noisily, through her nostrils which flared alarmingly. She looked at the ceiling, the wooden beams that bisected the farmhouse interior. "I don't blame you, you know. Blame you for involving Rudy in ... in what you do. But he is involved deeper than he knows how to manage, and he does it partly for you. But I don't blame you." Corden watched her carefully. "What's happened?" he asked. Finally, Anna moved, almost reluctantly, to the window and looked outside. She turned back to Corden and spoke in one long, sudden stream of words, clear, unhurried and precise and very characteristic of her. Police took him. They came this morning, around 8 a.m, 3 of them in a black car. A very shiny, big black car. What kind of police, Vopos? No, they certainly weren't local. Were they armed? Not that I could see. They didn't have any weapons on show, if that's what you mean. Stasi? Yes, Stasi, I suppose so. They were very polite, but insistent, you know. He went quite willingly. Well, he had no choice, of course, but he did seem surprised, but not surprised. Like he was expecting to see them, just not then. I don't know, it was just a feeling I had. Was he arrested? No, nothing like that. It was all rather friendly. Corden thought hard for a few seconds. Could they have just been friends of his, business people? Don't forget I grew up with police. My father and 3 uncles were all policemen, back when it meant something. I know police when I see them. Where did they take him? They didn't say. I've been trying to find out. And... Now it was Anna's turn to shy away from answering. Does the name Matthias Berg mean anything to you? Corden cocked his head to one side, aware that Anna had caught him by surprise. He spoke slowly, as if considering every word. I know he's one of the rising young hotshots in the Stasi. Quite the pin-up boy, I hear. Tipped to be a leading light of the new generation. Brimful of ideas, of course. Ready to throw over the old order once he gets far enough advanced. I checked him out about a year ago. Went to hear him make a speech. The contribution of the intellectual to the workers' struggle. How democratic socialism begins in the kindergarten. Something like that. Load of rot, of course, but he was impressive. I'll say that for him. Even got the feeling he actually believed some of it. Anna smiled and put a hand up to stop Corden going on. She touched his arm and kept her fingers there a moment. He is ideologically sound, ... in all important respects. He is committed to fighting American imperialism wherever it... Corden interrupted her rudely. Of course, he's only young. .24, 25. He's only just finished his military service. Straight out of bloody Potsdam, for Christ's sake. He's brilliant, but he's a fool. The older generation, the real bastards, they'll just wait for the right moment and pick him off. All of them. All these young reformers, these radicals. Pick them all off one by one. Corden seemed to run out of invective. He added in a conciliatory tone, From what I hear, he's decent enough. What's he got to do with anything? He's a friend, that's all. Corden stared at her in incredulity. He does a lot of good work round here, she continued more passionately. He's in charge of the party youth organisation, for one. I suppose, being cynical, you'd say it was just recruiting young minds to his way of thinking, shaping the future party in his own image. Corden remembered that both Anna's sons were enthusiastic members of the Young Communist League and often attended special camps they had arranged in the forests along the Czech border. He imagined them as somewhat like his own distant scouting days, only with socialist indoctrination rather than enforced allegiance to the British Empire. At that point, Johann came in carrying the tin bath on his back, comically, like a turtle. He was followed by Jonas, stepping carefully with a steaming kettle in his right hand and a bucket of cold water in his left. All these items were sat on the rug in front of the fire, and the boys stood back regarding their mother with looks of frank consternation. Go and get some clean clothes and towels, and get something warm. We're going on a journey. Where to? Asked Jonas excitedly. Never you mind, just go. There are some fresh towels in the airing cupboard. Both boys hurried out, and Corden followed the sound of their footsteps as they raced each other up the stairs, giggling. Where are you going? He asked Anna. She looked down briefly before replying. To find my husband. To find out what it is Matthias Berg wants with him. It was his people took Rudy. I'm sure of it. I don't know them. Didn't recognise any of them. But... But what? Anna sighed and hugged herself, as if for support. Rudy dropped a hint. He told me that he'd met Berg 3 days ago, in Adorf. He came down specially, in secret, at night. I don't know what they talked about. Rudy wouldn't say, but he did hint that it was the start of something. That Berg's people were likely to be in touch very soon. That's all I know. It fits. Rudy contacted me 2 days ago saying we needed to meet urgently. Something was up. It must be connected somehow. He wouldn't betray you. Anna had balled her fists and pressed them down her sides. Her sudden passion did nothing to hide her evident anxiety. He might not have any choice in the matter, said Corden dryly. Either way, it's too dangerous for you here. You must go. I'm taking the boys to Geising. Matthias is holding a camp there this weekend. It's just south of the Geisingberg. It's for older boys, young leaders. Jonas is insanely jealous. She turned away from Corden, only to find her sons lined up staring at her, towels and fresh clothing at the ready. She flashed a knowing smile to her elder son, but he just scowled in Corden's direction. You have to be 13 to 21. Next year, maybe. She smiled a different, rather sad smile that still lit up the room. The point is, if Matthias is there, that's where Rudy will be. One way or another, I'll find out what's going on. Rudy can contact you later, if that's still possible. You have to assume your cover's blown. You need to keep your distance for now, at least. I'll need some petrol, said Corden gently. He picked up the jerry can from the floor where he had placed it. I don't actually need any, you understand. I'm just being careful. It's cover for my coming here. My car's hidden up the slope. Once the boys are done, I'm driving you to Geising. I need to see Rudy to debrief him. Just 5 minutes, that's all I need. You have to find a way of getting me alone with him. 5 minutes is all. But what if it is a trap? This is to cover the petrol, if anybody asks. He handed her a small bundle of low-denomination currency and smiled at Anna. A gentle, rather sweet smile, but one that wouldn't be contradicted, so she simply took the money and told him where he would find a number of containers in the small barn. He could help himself to petrol from one of those. He went out without another word. On his return, Corden saw that the two boys were both in the process of getting undressed as their mother readied the bath for them. They both looked up sharply as Corden entered, although Anna didn't react at all. Concentrating as she was on sprinkling some kind of powder into the steaming water, which, when thoroughly stirred about, began to form a very satisfying mass of bubbles. Johann had his t-shirt off already and grinned widely in Corden's direction as he pulled his shorts down. He was not wearing underpants, and he simply handed his shorts to his mother, who glanced at them briefly, tutted at the stains and put them to one side. Corden's eyes momentarily rested on Johann's naked body. He was a slightly rotund child, plump and ruddy. His backside was plump and his thighs fleshy. His penis was large, almost indecently so in a child his age, and swung gently at every move. His small, undeveloped testicles were a mere fleshy sack, obscured by the long, soft thickness of his cock, which ended in a luxuriant ruffle of foreskin. Johann seemed completely at ease in the nude, a thoroughly natural animal, although Corden concluded that the degree of exhibitionism was mainly for Jonas's sake, to raise the stakes in their never-ending private game of brotherly one-upmanship. He stepped boldly into the foam, accidentally splashing Anna, who gave his bottom the lightest of slaps in admonition. He grinned even more, looking directly at Corden. Jonas, by contrast, was more hesitant. Although he had already removed his shorts and underpants, which were discarded carelessly on the floor beside him, he had on Corden's entrance, pulled the hem of his t-shirt down tightly to cover his privates. Corden could not decide whether the boy understood just how provocative this manoeuvre was. Probably he didn't, but the effect was immediate, and it might have been the most calculated of acts. Corden felt himself stirring at the sight of the elder brother, squirming and wriggling his thin, twisty frame, pantomiming reluctance and giggling deliciously at Johann. In a quick movement, he wrestled the t-shirt over his head, where it lodged for a second, masking the boy's features. His ribs were clearly defined, his body lean and mobile and entirely smooth. His little cock was thin and puny compared to that of his younger brother, but it was also held tight by a dainty pair of balls that had recently emerged, like new fruit on an apple tree. His buttocks were small and delicate, and he stepped delicately and quickly into the tub alongside Johann. He had already covered himself again with both hands cupped over his genitals, and he stood there shrugging, blushing deeply, and waiting patiently for his mother to wash him. For the next 10 minutes, Corden watched fascinated as Anna tended to her boys. Her hands soaped their little bodies relentlessly, cupping their limbs and working with enormous care and precision around their tenderest areas. With the quickest of light movements, she ran her hand underneath them, cleaning them between their legs, wiping them thoroughly. At various points, the boys pushed themselves into each other, Jonas's little penis rubbing briefly against Johann's rump, or Johann sticking his bottom out so that it touched that of his elder brother in a way that Corden could see was most pleasing and entertaining to the both of them. Anna kept up a whispered conversation, murmuring gently, lovingly. At one point, Jonas reached down and brushed Johann's cock with a finger. Whether accidentally or not, Corden couldn't decide. Either way, it seemed to him that the ease and naturalness of the contact was ultimately indicative of a great tenderness between the brothers. Eventually, Anna was satisfied with the boys' cleanliness, and with a little slap, she encouraged each of them to step out of the bath and onto the towels she had laid out for them on the floor. Jonas instantly wrapped himself in his towel, as if suddenly overcome with shyness, and he moved to a corner where he could dry and dress himself with more privacy. Johann displayed himself frankly in front of his mother and stood impassive, watching Corden as she rubbed at him and pulled wide a clean pair of pants so that he could step more easily into them. Corden glanced out of the window. The light was just beginning to dim outside. There seemed to be a slight pink mist drifting away into the woods. Strange. His mind turned, almost reluctantly, to the journey ahead. It was over 2 hours' drive, more like 3, and as he reflected gratefully on the cosy, domestic scene he had just witnessed, he realised that he had no idea what to expect at the other end. Episode 5, Mischief Maker. Thumping his bare, velvety brown chest, Nietzsche said, "Nietzsche, dilhilen din gar istzan," then motioning with his left hand's index finger pistoning through his right hand's circled thumb and forefinger, the native boy smiled and added, "Gonesnan tleish sidogda bitzizil gonol kaicha, shahe nei, cheeky chichnil." Pooh translated in his mind, "Nietzsche, black man's bunny woman, puts his 10-inch snake in my hot, hairless battle beaver, gives it to me all night long, girls just want to have fun. Busts his nut, acorn, pop goes the weasel." The imp was going to have to learn more Warm Springs Apache, or pay better attention to his aide's lover. There was mischief needed in the Vogtlandkreis, so Nietzsche needed to stop worrying about his own needs and focus on his first solo assignment, boys named Robert and Jonas. "Get your butt into the pink mist," demanded Pooh. As Nietzsche obeyed, his commander teased, "The commies are gonna love your hairless battle beaver." A night of fun with the twins and a few visitors ended with Pooh only getting an hour's sleep before being awoken by a noisy donkey and his aide-de-camp Robert Churchill blowing first call on his bugle, all coming from the courtyard. Most of his boys would be assembling once hearing the warning call. As that didn't necessarily mean danger was imminent, he would get to them later. And then there was Thomas and Gacy to visit. Tatters needed fresh meat. The Candyman wanted a progress report. Sparrows was still missing somewhere in the Barbary coast. Tinker needed more C4 for his fembombs. Delicatus needed someone to watch his sea turtle, while the 6-year-old Caligula was rehabbing at Promises Malibu. He needed to kill his grandfather again. So much to do. Climbing out of bed, Pooh discovered that his favourite bustier, the red one, was ripped along the side. His matching panties were nowhere to be found, and his stockings hung around his ankles. "Damn fermented nectar," he blurted out, over the 4 dead-to-the-world boys. 3 wrapped together on the bed, the Castrati twins and Splash, with the 4th hanging off a post. First call hadn't even aroused them, so they'd be receiving demerits from Pooh, even though he was the one responsible for getting them drunk and debauched. The immortal saw his garters were securing trainee Batbait's wrists to one of the bedposts. At least Camazotz had concentrated on the 6-year-old academy inductee. The Aztec bat god's nightly piss and other wet emissions from the rafters were restricted to that corner of the bed, saving Pooh his usual unwanted drenching. His plan to bait and distract the giant bat appeared to be working. For his part, trainee Batbait seemed to be okay with the hazing. Looking at the slumbering, soaked and bound boy, the imp thought, "That Chiroptera needs to go back to the rabies colony near Tenochtitlan, run his own shit, get his own child sacrifices, get the hell out of my tower. Bad idea, that Chiroptera. Bad idea. Thinks my pad is his Airbnb. I'll not have it." Despite his problematic chamber guest, Pooh had no real desire to send Camazotz packing anytime soon. The bumper bat had its uses, and it could swoop down and snatch a few of the Greek boys if it came to that. Through the broken stained glass window covered in web cobs that overlooked the courtyard, Pooh pushed open the tower's creaky, weather-beaten shutters and poked his head out. "Buffalo soldier, what in the heathen hell is this racket?" shouted Pooh. Looking up, a tall, lean, raven-skinned adolescent wearing a United States 10th Cavalry Frontier uniform responded, The swarm blitzed the lagoon and shanghaied Dionysos' favourite donkey, Agorimonta. The beast desires Demon Cam's affections. It seems there's a history there, and the jackass is searching for him, but Cam's gone to the abyss, left him roaming the courtyard before he black-misted. I'm calling in the troops and cadets in case there's an attack by the drunk god and his Greek paids and maybe the satyrs. Your command is at attention on the parade ground and ready for a fight, sir. Those Eromenos boys do look cute with their fannies hanging out of their short-hemmed togas and pretending to be butch. Let them come if they wish. Now get up here. Bring Nietzsche with you. I see the mischief maker behind you making googly eyes at Agorimonta. Mounting must wait. I've decided upon his first mission, so you'll need to get the trainees to toot your bugle and lay off that goddamn Romeo and Juliet bullshit for a few days. I'll deal with the swarm at midnight, Pooh finished. Marcus Ream smiled sweetly. Looking down at young Robert Strauss, a kind of urgency swelled within him, taking clear physical shape in the form of an aching bulge at the front of his trousers. At 18 years old, he had reached a time in his life when he was ready to affirm his manhood. He was already tall, strong and athletic, good-looking too, he thought, with only a slight trace of acne still on his face. And after what he had experienced in the past few weeks, he knew deep down that he was ready to reach out, ready to engage with the wider world, the predator world. Ready, in other words, to hunt. Sometimes his cramped but budding soul would ache with anguish when he contemplated the promise of his future life. He daydreamed endlessly of different types of boys. He fantasized about hair colour and complexion. He weighed, with near-professional objectivity, the merits of a slim youth against those of one more thickness. He speculated on the pleasure that would be had in sucking a short, thick cock as opposed to a long and slender one, and debated with himself the relative attractions of a lad endowed with pubic hair as set against one smooth as melted chocolate. But however far his fancies led, his thoughts always returned to Robert Strauss. Such was the exquisiteness of Robert's appearance, and so precisely did his manner and bearing correspond to that ideal of youthful perfection that Marcus nourished painstakingly in his imagination. At the same time, he knew very well that his romantic yearnings were just that. He had experienced similar feelings in relation to other boys for as long as he could remember, and whatever his immediate physical reaction to the beauty he perceived in a boyish form, whether the swift upbeating of his heart or the sometimes even swifter upsticking of his penis, Marcus sensed that it was the outward form only, not the inner personality, that engaged him so, and this meant that there was always a coolness, something abstract, about even his most ardent fantasies. He was thrilled by a generalized concept of boyishness, rather than by the actual charms of any individual boy, and had a guilty understanding that what was really required of Robert was that he be the passive object, merely, of the older boy's longings. So when Marcus gazed into Robert's deep dark eyes, or caught the sudden pensiveness that darkened his lovely face from time to time, a deep seriousness that flashed almost angrily and revealed itself in a narrowing of the brow and a slight, inexplicable reddening of the cheek, as if in sudden premonition of some impending catastrophe, he still knew that it was not, despite all pretences to the contrary, Robert's deepest, innermost self, with which he was ultimately engaged, but a mere inventory of that self, a mechanical checklist that allowed Marcus to satisfy his own most urgent emotional needs. Knowing this, he sometimes acted as if he hated the boy and treated him with high-handed disdain. Then he felt himself small and peevish and tried to make up for this pettiness by smiling sweetly. Robert was a timid boy, fairly small for his age, and not possessed of the kind of worldly experience that Marcus seemed to him to command so effortlessly. He reasoned to himself that Marcus was truly exceptional in his qualities, although he felt equally intimidated by other boys, even those his own age. He was secretly proud that Marcus, of all people, seemed to want him as a friend, and genuinely appreciated the fact that he was the beneficiary of a certain status and protection as a result. Having only recently turned 14, Robert was still slight and underdeveloped bodily, although his upper lip now bore the faintest of traces of hair that matched in darkness the short, straight hair on his head. He had rather mobile facial features, being still at that stage of growth where they hadn't quite meshed into a definite form, so that the chin and brow seemed, at times, out of proportion. His ears and Adam's apple were very prominent, and what remained of his childhood freckles were fading, their place being taken by a number of spots, which had begun to appear around his wide, red-lipped mouth. He was very conscious of these, for he was well aware of the need for good hygiene, and was mortified by the nevertheless intriguing scent that was sometimes given off by his adolescent body, unaware yet as to just how enticing such zesty hormonal signals could be and were, indeed, designed to be. He was an obedient, although sometimes willful, impulsive child, rather thoughtless in his superior, intellectual way, who rarely defied the authority of his parents or school teachers, but who was capable of a sly, maddening insubordination. On those occasions when he did openly rebel, he submitted resentfully to being beaten by his father, usually on the bare buttocks with a short length of a bamboo cane or hairbrush. It was as an indirect consequence of just such an encounter that very afternoon, when he had been on the receiving end of a deserved punishment, bent, shamefaced at his near nakedness, over a tall wooden stool in the presence of his mother and older sister, that Robert now stood before Marcus on this first evening of the weekend camp. The boys' parents were friends, near neighbours in fact. Adorf was a small enough town after all, and it was Robert's father on this occasion who had agreed to drive the lads to the Geisenberg campsite, the two men generally taking it in turns to do so. As he had arrived to pick Marcus up, Herr Strauss had confided, smilingly, to Herr Rim exactly how he had dealt with the theft from his wife's purse of, what seemed to Robert at the time, a trifling sum of money. Marcus had overheard, and was instantly taken up by an inexplicable hardness, a fullness pumping about his groin that would not leave him. Throughout the entire journey, Marcus had felt his thick, seeping erection calling to him through the thin fabric of his tented trousers, urging his attention, begging for a relieving hand. He had listened in an agony of sexual frustration as Robert's father had droned on at the wheel about the difficulty he was having securing a promotion at the furniture factory where he worked. Robert, seated next to him in the back of the car, was enduring an equally miserable time, shifting uncomfortably about on his beaten bottom and staring sulkily out of the window. Not even the prospect of the young leader's weekend camp was enough to distract either lad from their immediate, very different bodily concerns, although as they approached the campgrounds, both were somewhat cheered by the prospect of seeing Matthias Berg again, whom both boys respected greatly. They had arrived in good time, and Robert's father had waved them off, once they had retrieved their rucksacks from the trunk and had turned the car around without delay. They had watched him, manoeuvring clumsily, as a line of boys and young men passed close by, jogging alongside an adjacent field. He had driven past them, carefully, along the thickly wooded path, conscious that it would soon be getting dark. Marcus and Robert stood together, trying to establish their bearings, Herr Strauss having deposited them on the wrong side of the long wooden building that formed the camp's main living quarters. Here they would eat, sleep, and enjoy good socialist entertainment and education over the next 2 days. The running boys had already disappeared. Enthusiastic young leaders who had clearly arrived early at the camp and were wasting no time in demonstrating their keenness and fitness to lead by taking themselves off for some unsupervised evening exercise. The two boys had stood together, uncertain, side by side in the cool early evening air. Marcus wondered vaguely if Robert had spotted his erection. He had in mind some unsupervised evening exercise of his own, a plan forming in his head ever since he had overheard what Herr Strauss had told his father. As he turned to look at his friend's gorgeous, ugly face, he felt his cock rise again, another half-inch. Crazily, it seemed to be performing a dance in his underpants, a solo number that was crying out for a willing partner. "Come on, let's get inside," he said, and both boys trudged off with their rucksacks. It was understood that they would be sharing a room. As a senior boy, Marcus was entitled to one of the smaller, more private rooms, of which there were only 3 in total. Normally, these would be the preserve of the older boys only, 2 of them sharing each one, but Marcus had already arranged for Robert to enjoy this privilege, despite his being only 14. The other boys would have to make do with dormitory-style accommodation for 5 or 6 together, and Marcus justified his favouritism towards Robert on the grounds that he would be saving the boy from enduring the indelicacy of having to change and risk revealing his beaten ass in front of the larger, less discriminating group. He could change in front of him instead, something Marcus was very much looking forward to. They were evidently the first to stake a claim on any of the rooms, so had the pick of them. The one they chose was actually quite spacious, if rather bare. It had 2 small beds on either side of a single cabinet that supported an ancient decorative lamp with an enormous linen shade completely out of proportion to the lampstand, which it dwarfed. The only other items in the room were a tiny washstand, and spread invitingly on the cabinet, a small pile of communist-inspired literature aimed at boys, evidently the approved bedtime reading. Marcus considered that they could both give that a miss, if only for one night. "Dibs, I have this one," he said brightly, depositing his rucksack on the slightly larger, less shabby-looking bed. "Do you mind?" he asked, although he knew that Robert was in no position to object, and that even if he had been, he probably wouldn't have done so. "No," he mumbled. "Why would I?" Robert felt suddenly rather peevish, as if suspecting that something was going to be demanded of him, and wanting to assert himself on that account. He placed his rucksack on the floor at the foot of his bed and picked up one of the pamphlets, if only to satisfy himself that they bore no interest for him whatsoever. Now that they had completed all that could reasonably be done by way of settling in, which frankly wasn't much, a kind of listlessness had overtaken them both, as if they were co-conspirators in an obscure plot, the ultimate purpose of which was not immediately clear, but would very soon be revealed. However, it was not until later on in the evening that the opportunity would truly come. Before it did, Marcus had a number of duties to perform to ensure the administration of the weekend camp went smoothly. He therefore had to leave Robert, frustratingly, and report to one of the camp commanders to receive his instructions. After that, there was the usual confused ruckus as 30 more boys arrived, were signed in and were seated in the dining hall, where all enjoyed a hearty meal of sausage and sauerkraut. It was not, therefore, till nearly 10 that Marcus found himself alone again with Robert in their room, readying themselves for bed. They spoke little as they slowly undressed, shy and tired and cautious now that the moment had come. Shoes were stacked underneath the little sink in the corner and pyjamas produced. Robert had his shirt off already and was sitting on his bed contemplating how best to remove his trousers. The ache in his backside had pretty much gone now, but he was still very much aware that he would be marked, and with such distinctive marks that if anyone saw them, they would know straight away the sorry circumstances under which they had been acquired. Marcus kept glancing at Robert as if getting up the nerve to speak. Finally he swallowed hard, his heart beating fast, and said as casually as he could, "I hear you got in trouble at home. Your dad told my dad." There was no response from Robert, except for an embarrassed tightening around his mouth and a slight shifting on the bed. Marcus could not believe the equally revelatory tightening around his own groin that his words had produced. He was almost fully erect again, and was more aware than ever of the surely unmissable bulging in his trouser front. How could Robert not have seen it? Or had he noticed and was too embarrassed to comment? Was he appalled? Was he disgusted? In a whirlwind of uncertainty, driven on relentlessly by the blind pointing finger in his pants, what Marcus said next was blurted out with an urgency that sent the blood rushing to his head, so that when Robert finally replied, he didn't hear him properly and had to make him repeat his response just to be sure. "Let's have a look then. I mean, show me. Go on, I dare you. I bet you don't dare show me." There was a moment of still, whirling silence, a whirring, buzzing pressure, which seemed to hold the boys apart whilst at the same time pulling them inexorably together. "All right," said Robert in a small voice, still not even sure what he was agreeing to. "Please, I won't tell anyone," Marcus insisted, unconvinced by the gentleness and simplicity of Robert's acquiescence. "I said yes," repeated the boy, rather angrily, as if embarrassed that he had agreed so easily and thinking he couldn't now go back on his word. His instinctive nature was to resist what was transpiring between the pair, but something in the back of his mind was pushing him to acceptance. "Go on, then," urged Marcus, with a happy, confiding grin, feeling the dance go on, swelling him another half-inch. Robert nodded, rather gloomily now. He rose up from the bed and let his trousers drop, and then took a moment to peel them off and fold them, rather fussily. Turning his back to Marcus, he delicately pulled his little white underpants down at the back, baring his ass. Marcus leaned forward eagerly and stared. There was a definite crisscrossing of thin red lines, faded now and only slightly raised, which made a fascinating pattern on the lad's bum. There were a couple of darker places too, where the cane had been applied with more vigour, its strokes overlapping. "Wow," exclaimed Marcus. "I bet that hurt. Did you cry?" he asked, brutally. Robert was indignant at the question, for this was a delicate subject indeed. "No," he lied, glad that Marcus couldn't see the blush that he felt colour his cheeks. "Liar," said Marcus teasingly. "I bet you did." He then added in a more consoling tone, "I would have." Without asking permission, almost without thinking, he reached out a hand and placed the very tips of his fingers onto the smooth surface of Robert's backside and began moving them gently around the cuts, feeling the ridges where the cane had connected, imagining how terrible the lad's shame and humiliation must have been at his father's disciplining him in this way. Robert let out a gasp, more in surprise at the touch rather than discomfort, since the ache had long since subsided, to a deeply satisfying, tingling memory of pain, the sweet, enduring legacy of actual pain itself. His gasp became an unforced sigh as he relaxed contentedly, accepting the older boy's tenderness towards him. "It's okay," said Marcus reassuringly. "My dad used to belt me when I was your age. I always cried." He eyed the boy's beautiful form slyly. "And when I went up to my room after I used to have the biggest wank." Robert giggled like a child and blushed quickly, and having now made him laugh, Marcus spoke again in a more tender, considered tone. He moved close behind the boy, gripped him by the shoulders, and turned him round to face him. "Now you've shown me your bum, it's only fair I show you something too," he said, dragging the words out with a seeming reluctance that both boys knew was fake. "Your bum?" said Robert uncertainly. Marcus went quiet. "Do you want to see my cock?" Now it was Robert's turn to go quiet. He looked away, a stifled laugh gurgling in his throat. "Okay," he agreed simply, and then added as if stating the obvious. "I mean seeing you've had the most enormous stiffy ever since you got into my dad's car. Do you think I haven't noticed? I could hardly miss it. It's huge. Of course, I want to see it." All of Robert's reservations had been pushed completely from his mind. Marcus felt a dim faintness flutter round his heart. If he'd scripted their exchange himself, those would have been the exact words he would have chosen to put into Robert's mouth. And now the idea of putting something into Robert's mouth and elsewhere had come to him. He couldn't shake it off. He didn't ever want to shake it off. Marcus quickly undressed and stood before Robert, proud and twinkling. He gave his cock a couple of quick pulls to restore his erection. Boldly, he took Robert's right hand and placed it around his thick shaft, letting him hold him there, taking his pulse. "Go on, don't be scared," urged Marcus. "You can squeeze it tighter than that. Do it like you're wanking yourself off at home." Robert responded to the instruction. "It's so big," he muttered in awe. This hadn't been meant in flattery, to make Marcus like him more, but the statement was naturally welcome to the older boy's ears, and even more so to his ego, which swelled accordingly. But the effect of his own statement on Robert was somehow dispiriting, a discouragement. He was, after all, a practical lad, and was already thinking of the practicalities. "Have you ever done it?" asked Robert cagily. Marcus thought instantly of the incident 2 weeks before, the man doing it to him, making of himself a presence, perhaps forever, in the young man's mind, whenever doing it was talked about. Marcus made some instant mental adjustments and replied, "No, not really. No," he said quite convincingly. "I've had my chances, of course," he added with somewhat less conviction, and left it at that. He was relieved that Robert too was content to leave it at that. "Do you want to?" Robert's voice was small and indistinct. "What? You know." "What? Do it?" Robert took a big breath, then said hurriedly, "If you don't want to do it, that's fine. I mean, I could always suck you off or something instead, if that's okay." Marcus took a swooning moment to reckon if it was okay with him if Robert sucked him off. He had evidently underestimated the lad and his desires. "How about we do it all?" ventured Marcus. But Robert had now seemed to have gone quiet again, thoughtful and inhibited. Everything about him at that moment seemed to Marcus to glow with anticipation. He felt a heady mix of anxiety and inhibition, and at the same time the simultaneous promise of its release, as if some pulses were throbbing gently in the air between them. He gazed with a strange questioning and penetrating look into Robert's eyes. An air of perfumed decadence now multiplied the boy's gilded appeal 1,000-fold and bathed him further in a kind of dirty radiance. "It will be my first time. The welts will sting me, but okay," Robert commented morosely. Marcus smiled gently. Standing outside the long building, Nietzsche smiled too. His mind push had vanquished Robert's inhibitions towards his predator. He could now hear the boy's barely muffled moans as Marcus entered him, making the target's corruption complete. Now to arrange Robert's death. That would come later after the other corruption. What was the name? Jonas? Episode 5. Mingled Desires. Gregor Laimler, a little man with sandy hair, felt sure he was on the right track. This certainty stemmed not only from his deductive powers, but also from his burgeoning hunter's instinct, an instinct which was developing into a positive lust for the chase. He was convinced beyond all doubt that the residuary trustee, to borrow Gortz's jargon, was a woman named Maria Weber. When confronted by the tall, blonde, stalwart young SS officers with whom Heydrich liked to surround himself, he tended to feel like a poodle, frisking around in the midst of a pack of greyhounds. He believed in nothing on principle, and his sole interest in religions and political ideologies was that of a man who studied human idiosyncrasies as an entomologist might study the habits of the bee. His homosexuality wasn't a consuming passion. It was a simple matter of taste, like a predilection for chocolates, and one from which he could have abstained indefinitely if need be. Now 46, he already knew to the extent that it depended on himself what form his death would take. He would calmly commit suicide. His indifference to the life and death of others was even greater. He had sought and obtained Heydrich's permission to visit 6 of the concentration camps established from 1933 onward, including Dachau, Oranienburg, Sachsenhausen, and Buchenwald. The tour had interested him profoundly, especially seeing young Jewish boys and men brutally mistreated and used for depravity. But it left him quite unmoved. Heydrich's offer of employment as head of Operation Schadelbohrer had come at an ideal moment. He had been on the point of resigning his chair at any case, not because of the expulsion of Husserl, whose foremost pupil he had been. Husserl was of Jewish extraction, nor because of the oath of loyalty Hitler demanded of all university professors and duly taken by such luminaries as Martin Heidegger, but because the Third Reich's education policy had condemned him to teach a bunch of morons. And above all, because he wanted to devote himself to writing and had the means to do so, relieved of any financial worries by a fortune inherited from his late lamented mother. He accepted Heydrich's offer partly to save argument, but also because, for the first time in his life, he was surprised at himself. Usually so unmoved by anything or anyone, he found the prospect of Operation Schadelbohrer fascinating. Maria Weber. Laimler picked up the threads of the investigation where the SD's agents had left them. Born in 1909, Maria was Thomas the Elder's granddaughter, the child of his only daughter's marriage to a French industrialist of Alsatian origin. She studied in Paris, where her ample means enabled her to occupy an 8-room apartment at 23 Rue Renoir, all by herself. In August 1931, she terminated the tenancy without leaving a forwarding address. There had been no further sign of life from her, either in Germany or in France. Basically, she had vanished into thin air. If dead, she must have died under another name, because every possible register had been checked. But Gregor Laimler didn't believe she was dead. He saw her disappearance in 1931 as the product of a plot between Thomas von Gaul and his only surviving direct descendant. Such was the line of inquiry on which Laimler concentrated exclusively from the outset. He went off to Paris, his French was excellent, and interviewed all those who had known the girl as a law student. The picture beformed of her was not only clear-cut but intriguing. Maria Weber had been an exceptionally secretive person whose private life was a closed book. She was lovely to look at, made frequent visits to unknown destinations, spoke German, English and Spanish as well as French, played tennis extremely well, had a passion for beautiful things and more than enough money to indulge herself, liked Coco Chanel suits, tea roses, the best restaurants, jazz, and driving her Bugatti at reckless speeds. Her one brief allusion to home was made while dining at the Dome in Montparnasse with a party that included Cocteau, Hemingway, and Gertrude Stein. When someone mentioned Suzanne Lenglen, she smiled, that mysterious smile of hers, and said, "I played her once on my parents' tennis court and took 4 games off her." Maria Weber's parents were both dead. Her father, Pierre Weber, had been killed while leading his French infantry battalion into action at Verdun in 1916. Her mother, Minus, née von Gaul, had died in 1926. Neither their home nor any of Thomas the Elder's properties had ever boasted a tennis court, which seemed to suggest that Maria must have owned a house whose whereabouts she had never divulged to anyone. Doggedly trying to retrace her steps 8 years later, Gregor Leimler spent 4 months compiling a list of 164 persons who had known her in some capacity or other: concierges, waiters, hotel porters, tennis partners, fellow law students. None of them possessed a photograph of Maria. Several recalled that she had always shied away from cameras. Lying low, Leimler told himself. She was already lying low. Then a miracle occurred. Coco Chanel, to whom he was given an introduction by the designer Christian Berard, reported that a woman had ordered 8 or 10 model gowns to be delivered to a suite at the Ritz. She had paid for them in cash and then disappeared. The reception desk at the Ritz had her registered as S. Lamiel, born in Grenoble in 1908. Gregor Leimler's memory sounded the alarm. There was a Sophie Lamiel on the list of 164 names, a Sophie Lamiel whom several witnesses referred to as Maria Weber's best friend, but whom Leimler had failed to interview for the very odd reason that she had officially died in a car crash in July 1931. The Sophie Lamiel who had stayed at the Ritz was brunette, like the dead woman, but taller and more beautiful. She had grey eyes as unforgettable as her smile, said the barman of the Ritz, the kind of woman you don't see twice in a year. After checking out, she had vanished with the same virtuosity Maria Weber had displayed in August 1931. Their particulars tallied. Their style and taste were identical. The unknown woman had requested that her suite be adorned with fresh tea roses every morning. Leimler left immediately for Grenoble. He had no contacts there and conducted his inquiries with extreme discretion. Convinced that he was close to his objective, he had no wish to do anything that might alert his opponent, who had begun to obsess him. The Lamiels of Grenoble were a prosperous family who owned a country house, but no tennis court. The family was comprised of a doctor, his wife, and their 2 children. There had been 3, but the eldest daughter, Sophie, had died at the wheel of her Bugatti in 1931. For a second or two, the professor-turned-manhunter felt his heart pound at the sight of a young, dark-haired woman in a pastel summer dress walking ahead of him down the Rue Condillac. He thought for one moment that he had rediscovered Maria Weber, but it was only Catherine Lamiel, one of the late Sophie's sisters. Her eyes were blue, not grey. She was only 22, and she had certainly never set foot in the Ritz, however decorative she would have looked in such a setting. Anxious not to give the game away by pursuing his investigation of her and her family too far, he decided to play his Spanish card. After all, hadn't he been told that Maria Weber was fluent in the language? He moved on to Spain, where the Gestapo's Madrid outstation placed itself at his disposal. It was a sheer waste of time. June went by, then July. Gregor Leimler, now travelling on a Swiss passport, nonchalantly toured the French Riviera in quest of luxurious villas equipped with tennis courts. He'd started work on another novel, but was exasperated to find that Maria Weber intruded between every line he wrote. The alarm signal sounded on August 17th. A Sophie Lamiel had checked into a big Lisbon hotel from New York and stayed there for 3 days before disappearing once more. The trail was already a week old. Leimler picked it up again himself. It occurred to him that she might have gone on to France and checked into another grand hotel. He caught the next available train, but missed her at Biarritz by 12 hours. She had, in fact, stayed at the Hôtel d'Angleterre. Having devoted the morning, afternoon and evening of August 26th to a number of mysterious meetings, she had asked for a typewriter, large quantity of writing paper, and 200 envelopes to be sent up to her suite. On the morning of the 27th, she mailed the fruits of her labours in person. It was on this occasion that the head receptionist spotted one of her bodyguards. He used the plural because, in his opinion, there were at least two, if not more, of obviously Spanish appearance. Their leader, who wore a black leather jacket, was a very tall, gaunt man with a face like stone and eyes fit to chill your blood, a man with 2 fingers missing from his left hand. She had quit the hotel, and doubtless Biarritz as well, on the morning of the 28th, but not without leaving 2 important clues behind. First, there were the purchases she had made with the aid of directions given her by one of the hotel's bellhops, an enormous box of chocolates from Dominique's, and more especially, a complete Meccano set from Biarritz Bonheur. "It's for an 8-year-old boy with the mental age of 14 or 15, she'd told the shop assistant with a smile. "If I know him, he'll turn up his nose at such a babyish present." Then there was the car she'd boarded prior to her latest vanishing trick. Chauffeured by the man with the mutilated hand, it was an exceptional and unique model. A 12-cylinder Hispano-Suiza coupe with an engine displacement of 11.3 litres. 1 or more Spanish bodyguards. More promising still, a car and a boy of 8 years old. A boy who would have been born in 1931, the very year when Maria Weber left her Rue Renoir apartment and vanished. A boy who might therefore be her son, who might be hidden somewhere in France, possibly at a house with a tennis court, why not, and who would constitute a most effective means of persuasion if he could be captured. As for that magnificent car, every head must have turned as it sped past. Tracing it ought to be as easy as organising a paper chase. "Got her," thought Lamela, trembling with an eagerness that surprised him. "Got her. It's only a matter of hours, days at most." Then war broke out. To Gregor Laimel, the war seemed at first no more than an idiotic episode that compelled him to suspend Operation Schadelbohrer and threatened to ruin it altogether. As the months went by, however, he came to realise that he would now be able to enlist the support of the armies of the Third Reich, which were physically present and all-powerful throughout most of his hunting ground. He would rather have continued to operate alone for the sheer beauty of the thing, but what could he do? Besides, Heydrich was losing patience. In September 1940, Lamela entered Paris on the heels of the Wehrmacht. He did so in civilian clothes, even though Heydrich had insisted on appointing him an Obersturmbannführer, a lieutenant colonel in the SS. The hunt resumed at once. Thomas began by climbing into the back of the Hispano-Suiza, rediscovered the smoothness of the black leather upholstery, found he still couldn't put his feet on the footrest. They were several inches short of it. He opened the walnut bar. The cut-glass Lalique decanters were there, and so were the glasses. He visualised her pouring him a drink, lemonade, as the car glided majestically along the Promenade des Anglais, its 12 cylinders emitting an almost inaudible growl. She habitually addressed him in low voice, confiding in him as if he were a grown-up, or better still, her sole companion and accomplice. "You've always been the only man in my life, Thomas, and you always will be." He shivered and shut his eyes, then opened them again. Although he'd heard nothing, he sensed that someone was there in the shadows. He could make out nothing, though. Then something else came to him. A second presence, a strong musk scent, made him squeeze his thighs together as the small hairs on the back of his neck and arms rose up. Thomas gasped out a small moan in rising desire. Javier Coll had followed him into the rocky hideaway and was right beside the car, watching him impassively. Their eyes met, and Thomas felt a heat between them. Then, swallowing, Thomas gestured for him to come closer. Javier opened the door, doffing his cap like a chauffeur with the rifle still in his other hand. Javier was having the same effect on Thomas as Miguel had had. Was he to present himself to every man that came along as the rising took hold, or just until he found the right mate? "Está muy limpio," said Thomas. "We clean it once a month," Javier replied in French. Moving from the back, Thomas got in behind the wheel, making sure Javier got a long look at his hindquarters. The boy's invitation to the man was clear, but Javier remained non-committal, so Thomas returned to focusing on the car. He felt for the pedals with his feet. He could operate them now, unlike when he was 8. He played with the lever, the one that adjusted the shock absorbers, and the other two, which enabled you to advance or retard the spark. Briefly, he thought about reaching out for Javier's lever, but chose to choke his craving down. He ran his fingers over the magnificent dashboard, while thinking about running his fingers over Javier. All the dials, the speedometer went up to 200 kilometers, were set in walnut veneer. The ignition key was there. He had only to switch it on and press the starter. How could he press Javier's starter? I'm big enough to drive it now. I'm big enough for many things now. Of course, said Javier with a heavier breath. Seeing Thomas's backside had sent an aching into his loins. Today's my birthday. I simply had to come here. I'm glad you joined me, Thomas said with a tease. I know. Many happy returns, Chico Encantador. Thank you, said Thomas, blushing at being called lovely, then caressing the wheel suggestively. Another exchange of suggestive glances, another silence. Although Javier wanted nothing more than to bend Thomas over the seat and take the submitting boy's offering, he quietly remarked that it wasn't the best of times to visit the hideaway. The rest he left unsaid. Thomas nodded with disappointment, his grey eyes widening a little in the gloom. He could have asked if the Red Villa was under some kind of threat, as he'd sensed it to be since dawn, but that would have put Javier even more on guard and made him insist on leaving the Hispano at once. Thomas was here for the Hispano and memories of her, but he was now also here to give himself to Javier, or Miguel. It was just that Javier got there first, and it was his choice who Thomas would first mate with. The boy could smell Javier's dominating scent, equally strong as his own submissive desire to be mounted. Now that he was clearly an estrus and receptive to be taken by a dominant male from his pack, he was being made to fight those cravings back. He forced his mind back to his memories as he recalled that morning on the Grande Corniche. At her request, Javier had parked the Hispano on the edge of a big drop. Javier got out and strolled off. The Citroën escorting them, with Miguel Ensenat at the wheel, had also pulled up and was almost concealed by a bend in the road. As soon as she was sure they were really alone, she'd asked him what he would like to do most in the world. He thought carefully before answering, as he always did, but only for a moment. Apart from living with her all the time, not that this was possible, he knew. He yearned to drive the Hispano at least once in his life. She gazed at him for a long time, then nodded, looking very sad all of a sudden. If that's what you want, you can try it right now, she said. They got out and took their places in the front seat, which was outside the passenger compartment. At this season of the year, the late summer of 1939, the black leather hood that shielded it from the elements was folded back. She said, "Take the wheel, Thomas." He did his best, but it was no use. His legs weren't long enough for him to work the pedals. In the rear of the car, he couldn't even reach the footrest. She didn't laugh or make fun of him in the least, just went on gazing at him so tenderly and sadly that he wanted to cry. She said it was only a matter of time before both his wishes would come true. Then she looked up and down the road to make doubly sure that no one was within earshot, and asked if he remembered all she'd told him the day before while they were walking side by side along the beach at Port Iso. He concentrated, as only be knew how, and it was as if a key had turned in his head. He repeated everything word for word, names, codes, figures, and all. It took a long time, so he smiled at her when he'd finished, feeling not a little proud of himself, and that was when the strangest thing happened. Instead of returning his smile, she began to weep, very softly, with a total absence of sound and movement, but stricken by a sorrow whose irresistible intensity he recognised in a flash, because she didn't make it a habit of crying. Thomas would never, in fact, have believed her capable of it. He was petrified for a moment or two, imagining that it must be his fault and that his memory had played him false. But no, it was nothing of the kind, so he felt a savage hatred for the lousy world that was causing her such distress. Again and again in the years that followed, like a never-extinct volcano, this scene on the Grande Corniche continued to erupt in his mind. He analysed it repeatedly with surgical precision, recalling every word, every vocal infliction, every silence, every one of the minuscule tremors that had afflicted the face of his beloved mother. And each time he experienced the same anguish, the same terrible remorse to having failed to tell her that he understood and approved of all she'd had to do, that he was content to see her only for brief periods, at long intervals and in secret, that he didn't hold her responsible for the mission she'd been entrusted with, which compelled her to lead the life of a hunted beast and conceal the very existence of a son who might be used as a weapon against her. There were so many other things he would have liked to tell her now. For instance, how much he appreciated the unique complicity that had existed between them ever since he learned to speak, because she had never treated him like a child and always asked his opinion on everything, doubtless for want of the husband she'd never had. "I only knew your father for a short time. He didn't count. He doesn't even know of your existence. If you want to make his acquaintance someday, the decision will be yours alone." Their complicity was underlain by a love that bordered on veneration. When he was away from her, his merciless memory would conjure up visions of her hair, her hands, her lips, summon up the sound of her voice and her wonderful smile, even the fragrance of her, with a clarity that rent his heart. Javier Cole was speaking. He spoke, and Thomas's mental film show ended abruptly. "We'd better not hang around here," Javier repeated. "Vámonos," said Thomas. Obediently, he climbed out of the Hispano and made his way back through the cave. He felt Javier grope his buttocks and heard him whisper, "Soon." They emerged into the open air with Thomas panting. It was broad daylight now. The rocks were already baking in the heat of the sun. The cicadas had started chirping. Thomas, who could still feel the dankness of the cave in his bones, was blinded by the glare. But the brutal transition had not impaired his wolf's instinct. His inexplicable premonition of danger returned in a flash, far stronger than before. He swung around intending to catch Javier's eye and seek confirmation of his fears, but he had no time to complete the movement. A huge hand seized his arm and tugged at it. "Muy pronto, Thomas! Data prisa!" They broke into a run. Episode 6. The Swarm. After sending the Warm Springs Apache on his mission, Pooh met with the troops and told them to stand down, but to stay on a heightened alert. After his other mundane business was attended to, the time was approaching midnight, so the imp headed off for his appointment in the abyss, really outside of it, as he could not enter the black mist at risk of immortal death. All the realms had their codes and protections, so he'd just stand outside the black mist and scream from his pink mist. Yelling into the black mist, Pooh demanded that Damien come forward and explain how it was that his swarm had invaded Dionysus Lagoon, ravaged the Greek boys, had carnal relations with a donkey, kidnapped said donkey, and then dumped said donkey, now longing for Demon Cam, in the middle of his courtyard on the isle where the swarm were by treaty not to set foot on. Except Cam. Cam was okay to visit. Pooh and Cam had a thing going. Big lips, tight panties couldn't get any better than that Danish boy. But not his brother. That one was not welcome. It took Agent Banshee over 100 years to regrow his eyes. All that wailing and tripping over everything was just too much. The donkey should be with the brother, thought Pooh. Let that demon do some wailing. Damien's aide screamed into the pink mist that his master was away, so Pooh piddled around in his zone and considered a few things. He was not worried about the Greeks attacking the isle to recapture the donkey. They were by and large too wasted to put up a good fight, and they certainly lacked the numbers to be troublesome. Now, he needed to travel to October 22nd, 1843, to just north of Ithaca, New York, along the banks of Cayuga Lake. In fact, he needed to do that immediately, as the trouble there needed his attention before it was locked in and could not be affected. Trouble that Damien and his swarm were clearly involved in. Pooh just knew it. The journals he'd taken in New Mexico back in August 2012, then later returned, mentioned some misdeeds in 1843 that had the swarm's fingerprints all over it. There were bloodlines in danger. The air was still as the lake waters softly rolled up the shoreline and retreated back. Greg Bentham and Luke Milson sat with their backs to the water and watched the group of people standing in a circle several yards from them. They were softly praying, and neither of them could hear what it was they were saying. "Do you think they actually believe this nonsense?" Luke whispered to Greg. "There is something to be said for the devout." Greg shrugged. He looked up at the moon that was overhead. They had been sitting here since the sun had gone down almost 3 hours ago. "Everyone has a need to believe in something." Luke shook his head at what he was watching. This, in turn, caused his long black hair to roll over his face a bit. His hair sat just below his shoulder, and he usually kept it tied back, but he decided tonight he would let it hang loose. There was no need to be proper tonight. His eyes were a dark brown that captured the light of the moon and glimmered. Greg looked at Luke and bit his bottom lip. He had deep feelings for his friend, but knew better than to act on them or express them. That would be deadly. "You know," Luke said, looking out of the lake, "it is almost midnight, and nothing is happening." Greg turned his attention back to the group, not wanting to stop looking at Luke. Even if he could tell Luke how he felt, Luke would never return the feelings. Luke was married and had 2 children. Greg was too young to take a wife. Being age 14, it wasn't yet required, however. He was expected to show some interest in girls. His failure at that was leading to rumours. Luke always told Greg that you never married for love. You married them because you could tolerate them, and then love came later. If you waited for love, you would never get married. Greg disagreed. Love had to come first, and he knew he could never love a woman. "What do you suppose they will do when nothing happens?" Luke brought Greg out of his thoughts. "I mean, most of them sold all their possessions. They have nothing to go to." "I have no idea." Greg shifted his weight over to prop himself up on his left arm, which brought him closer to Luke. "What would you do?" "I would throw myself off a cliff." Luke turned to face Greg, leaning against his right arm, which placed him mere inches from Greg's face. "I mean, people think you are possessed for doing this in the first place. Imagine if it didn't come true. How much of a case are you then?" Greg had to turn his head back to the group before he was overcome with the urge to kiss Luke. "Either way, we will have a great story." "That we will." Luke continued to watch Greg. It was almost midnight, and nothing had transpired yet. This group, which were known as Millerites, were waiting for the end times. According to the prediction of their leader, the end was supposed to take place by this date. Many of the followers had sold their possessions in anticipation of the rapture. Now, in a last feat of their faith, they stood together waiting for the end times. There were about 20 members, some children, standing in a circle, praying. Greg and Luke had been following their activities, with Luke writing up an exposition of the activities for a newspaper back in New York, while Greg, the son of an editor, tagged along as a budding journalist apprentice. Greg felt bad for exploiting a group of people's faith to sell papers, but it was their job. He never sent anything in about people's real names. He could not live with that on his conscience. He also kept the more macabre things they had discovered to Luke and himself. No need to air everything out to the public. They both sat silently watching the group, which was now apparently finding the end was indeed not near. Some of the group looked defeated and hurt. One by one members of the group departed. Greg felt pain for them. They'd put everything on the line for their faith, and it never happened. Greg watched them walk off down the riverbank, back to their homes, if they had one left. Luke poked Greg in the shoulder and motioned to the last of the group. There were still 5 members standing and still praying. They were not going to give up as easily as the others had. "Maybe they will wait till the sun comes up," Luke suggested. "Well, they can wait." Greg stood up, dusting off the grass and other natural debris off his pants. "I think this is enough for our article." Greg offered a hand to help Luke up. Luke grabbed his hand and pulled himself off the group. Behind them, a large snap crack, like that of lighting, drew Greg's attention. Distracted, he let go of Luke's hand and turned around to investigate the sound. Luke fell backwards, giving a yell that reverberated across the clearing. "Damn you, Greg," Luke said as he lay on the ground. He started in, but noticed Greg had turned fully around and was not paying attention. Luke turned his gaze around Greg to see what he was looking at. The 5 members were now lying on the ground, motionless. Greg started to walk towards the group, and Luke hurried to get himself picked up and ran after Greg. "What in all that is holy?" Luke said as he came up on the scene. Each of the members had their eyes burned out, as if they had some acid poured on them, and their faces had the look of soundless pain on their faces. Greg made his way around the circle. Each of the 5 men had the same burned-out eyes. Each of them had that same dreadful look. "What could have caused this?" Luke asked, his face white. Greg had never seen him that shaken before. They had seen some horrific things in their reporting careers, even Greg's quite short one. Death was a constant for them, but nothing like this. "I would say they burnt their own eyes out, but I don't see how." Greg rejoined Luke at where he started to walk around. "It wouldn't have killed them anyway. Painful, yes, but not deadly. And if this was part of some ritual, why would the other members leave? Let's get out of here, Luke said, walking backwards from the circle. We did not see anything. Agreed. Greg turned to follow Luke, but his eye caught the glint of something in the grass. Hold up. Greg stepped over the bodies and made his way to the shiny object, which lay at the direct centre of the circle. He reached down and picked up the object. It was a black, jagged stone, the size of a quarter. It was shiny and reflected the moonlight perfectly. Hey, look at this, Greg said, bringing the stone over to Luke. I wonder what they used this for. I don't know, Luke said, looking at the rock quickly, and then started to walk as fast as he could, without running, back towards town. He felt something dark coming from the stone, and he didn't want to be around it longer than he had too. And I don't care to find out. Greg shrugged and put the rock in his pocket. It would make a nice memento of the occasion, even if it ended in such a tragic fashion. Terry Bentham was enjoying a nice cup of morning coffee in an out-of-the-way coffee shop that sat a few blocks from his private Albuquerque high school. Several other students sat around chatting about the beginning of classes, relationships, and other oddities. He was enjoying this spot, as only students and faculty were there. The lights were dim, so you could feel relaxed, with sofas and big chairs strewn about, placed in groups around the edge of a big room. He was currently sitting in one of the big chairs, which seemed to swallow his whole body. One of the things he enjoyed most about this location were the guys. Finally, high school boys and grown men. But not the typical jocks or the annoying rich boys, but boys who had their heads on straight and had a high level of intelligence. Not that he didn't think jocks and rich boys could be intelligent, but typically they were just after some piece of ass for the night, loud parties, or getting drunk or high. After all, it was high school. He sometimes felt it was stereotypical to think that way, but he had yet to find one that did not fit that set. Terry was focused on one particular man sitting on the other side of the room. He was tall, with broad shoulders. His hair was a dark black that was short and combed forward. His body was average, to say the least, but that was okay with Terry. He liked to see people that did not mind eating a hamburger and did not require an afternoon in the gym as repentance. Dad bods were cool, had been cool for him since he was 10. The big problem was the daddy type was out of his league, his age league. Terry was a 14-year-old freshman, and he was probably a 40-year-old teacher. Being a newbie freshman made it difficult to find guys. Biggest problem was they had to be into boys, and for the men be into underage boys. They always wanted older students, or if a junior high was near to exploit some poor kid in 6th or 7th grade. He needed to upgrade from the pedophiles he was used to and find a pederast. Again, the stereotypical view never seemed to escape him. He sipped his drink and looked down at his phone. He had 20 minutes to get back to his new school, gather his materials, and be in homeroom to start his first class of the year. Greg Rivers walked into his office to grab his papers that he needed to hand out and a copy of the textbook for the class. He stuffed the papers and the textbook into a soft leather briefcase. The bag also contained 2 black pens, a red pen, a black whiteboard marker, and 3 Sharpies. Insanely, his office did not adjourn his classroom. He hurried down the hall. He had 5 minutes to get there before the class started. As he approached the room, he saw various students walking into the classroom looking excited for their class to start. Some were saying hi to those they knew, or introducing themselves to someone they might have a connection with. Of course, there were always the guys who tried to hit on the attractive girl as a possible romantic encounter. He got to the door and entered. Several of the students he recognized from previous classes, but there were some new faces he did not recognize. He looked at the clock on the wall and saw that it was time to start. "Please find a seat and we will get started," he said. The rest of the class sat down and sat silently waiting for instructions. He pulled out the syllabus for the class and passed it to the student closest to him. The student in turn passed it on to those around him. "This is AP History, Religion and Doomsday Beliefs. Here, you are required to take 2 religion classes per year, but this one is rather unique even for this particular school. This class is by invitation only, but open to any age. If you are in the wrong class, you can sit to avoid being embarrassed, or you can just get up and leave." He paused, and no one got up. He then pulled out a blank sheet of paper and handed it to the same student sitting in the front desk. "Please write your name on the paper. This will be the attendance for the day. For this semester, we will be looking at the history of doomsday thinkers and how religion has influenced those beliefs. We will be looking at some of the—" He paused as a student ran into the room late. Greg hated late students and was about to explain this but stopped short. It was the boy he found highly attractive at the coffee shop. Just his luck. Totally out of his league for age and a student. Illegal too. "You are late, sir." "Sorry," the kid said. "I'm new to the campus and I got lost. It will not happen again." "Make sure it doesn't." He pointed to an empty chair, which the kid quickly moved to. "As I was saying, we are going to look at the history of doomsday thinkers, how religion played a role in their thinking, and why people are so fascinated by such ideas." He paused and looked around the room. There were around 30 students in this class. He always had more students wanting to take this course, as there was a high amount of interest, more so this year than previous years. "After all," he continued, "you are all here. You are all interested in doomsday ideologies, and I am sure you all want to know more about this 2012 prediction. Where did it come from? What does the real Mayan calendar mean? And why your parents wanted this class in the school?" Of course, there is always the question as to why people are interested in the end of the world. Why would people want a mass extinction event? There is always the human need to find the end, and people are willing to follow someone, even if it flies in the face of logic. People will sell their possessions. They will give all their money to someone who says they have all the answers. They will even go so far as to kill themselves, all in the name of finding an answer to the ultimate question, when will the world end? Greg turned his attention to the syllabus and what was expected from students in the class. This was run-of-the-mill information, and nothing was new for most of the students, who were juniors or seniors already. But the handful of freshmen and sophomores seemed dazed. He also instructed them that the book was optional, but would be a valuable tool during their semester final. The students were reminded that they could get college credit for the class, so making a good grade was important. "Are there any questions?" Greg asked, and waited a moment for anyone that may have a question. "Before we go, there is one thing I want to say. All religions have some form of a final reckoning. There is always something that will bring the world to a close. It is a fascinating subject, but it is also something of a mystery. I will see you all tomorrow. Please don't be late." He looked at the late kid as he stated the last part. As he was about to walk out the room, one last person in the room stopped him, the boy that came in late. "Mr. Rivers, I am so sorry for being late. I promise not to be late again. I am not a big fan of late people." Greg turned around. "But seeing as you are new, some mistakes can be tolerated on the first day." "Thank you," he put his hand out. "My name is Terry Bentham." "Greg Rivers." Greg extended his hand out and gave a firm shake. His hands were strong, but soft. Greg let his hand linger longer than was necessary. Terry's eyes were dark brown, and it was hard to tell where the iris ended and mixed with the pupil. He found himself getting lost in his eyes. "I know. Everyone says you're the best teacher for history," Terry said, not seeming to mind the extra-long handshake his teacher was providing him. "I am interested in doomsday ideology, as one of my ancestors, Greg Bentham, Greg like you, was able to observe and actually wrote about one of the more famous events, the Millerites." Greg let go of Terry's hand and looked shocked. "Really? I have some of his journals if you would like to look at them. They were never published accounts, as he felt they were too personal." Terry grinned. He always said they were too dark for public consumption, and he also had an interesting journal entry about the night the end was supposed to come. "On October," he trailed off. "October 23rd, 1844, Greg said absently. "I know there has been a great deal written about the topic, but I would be interested in reading those journals." "Great," Terry said, smiling bigger. His teeth were perfectly white and straight. He either was born lucky or had a good orthodontist when he was younger. Greg rubbed his tongue over his own crooked tooth that could never be straightened out. He always hated smiling because of it. "I saw you at the coffee shop down the street. Would you like to meet there tomorrow? I can bring one of the books with me if you want." "Sure." Greg thought for a second. "How about 3:30? I will have my last class by then." "Sounds good." Terry walked out the door, leaving Greg behind. Just great, he said to himself as he walked out the classroom heading for his office. All I need is to find myself falling for one of my students. The next day, Greg walked into the coffee shop and looked at his watch. It was just 3:30, and the place was almost empty. There were 3 male teens, about 15 maybe, standing at the counter waiting for their order, but other than that, it was empty. He made his way to the counter to give his order. Hello, Greg, the young woman behind the counter said. She was a college student, with blonde hair and green eyes. She was pretty by all standards, and guys loved to come see her. He guessed that's why the 3 teens were standing around waiting for their order. Hi, Tina, Greg smiled. I will just have my usual, please. That will be $3.50. Tina smiled as Greg gave her $5. It will be just a moment. I will bring it to you if you want. She returned the change. Thanks, Tina. Greg shoved the $2.50 in change into the tip jar. Greg waited another 5 minutes and started to get up when the door opened and Terry walked in flustered. Greg frowned as he stood there and watched Terry come up to him out of breath. Mr. Rivers, Terry started, I am so sorry about being late. I know this makes it twice that I was late for something with you. Are you going to start making this a habit, Mr. Bentham? Greg said with a cold stare. God, the boy was adorable, but he had to keep his professionalism. He was a student after all. Sorry, sir, Terry responded, looking down at the floor. I went to my house, but someone had broken in and destroyed the place. My mum is dealing with the police right now. Greg turned red and rubbed his hands together in a nervous tic. He had stuck his foot in his mouth on this one. I'm sorry. Is everything okay? Yes, Terry said, looking around the coffee shop. He spotted the trio sitting near the counter, but moved on as he saw they were highly interested in the waitress. Nothing was taken that I could tell. There were some scorch marks on the back door and what looked like claw marks, but it was probably just the tools they used to break in. That is good. Greg pointed to the door. Do you need to return? No, he said, glancing at the door in nervous motions. Mum is taking care of everything. Okay. Greg raised an eyebrow. The boy standing in front of him was definitely nervo and needed to calm down. Do you want something to drink? Coffee? Yes, please. Terry sat in the chair Greg had been occupying, which faced the door. Greg frowned but decided to leave the situation alone. The boy was freaking out, which was understandable. You don't have your home invaded and act like it is nothing. Greg walked to the counter. Tina asked to be pardoned from the men and walked up to Greg. Tina, can I have a coffee, please? Greg looked back at Terry. And make it as dark as you can. Everything okay? Tina asked, looking over at the pale boy fidgeting nervously. He had his home broken into. Greg turned to look at the 3 teens who had turned their attention to Terry. Something in Greg's stomach turned. Something was off. Oh my, Tina said. Coffee is on me. I will bring it to you in a moment. Greg walked back to where he had been sitting and sat down in the chair opposite Terry. He could not get the feeling out of his mind that something more was going on. Something Terry was not telling him. He leaned forward, trying to look into the dark brown eyes that he found drawn to, as well as haunted with fear. Are you sure you are okay? Terry looked at the door for another quick glance. Yes, I am fine. I just don't want to back there right now. Mum is going to stay at a neighbour's house, but I don't want to go there. I told her I could stay with a friend, he said. Do you have other family here? Greg asked again, trying to pull more information out. Terry looked at Greg like he was crazy before shaking his head and coughed. No, I'm here with just Mum because of her work. Nearest family is back in New York. Okay. Why don't we go to your place, pick up some clothes and whatever else you need, and you can stay at my place for a few days, with your mother's permission. Greg swallowed hard, as he was unsure why he was offering a near stranger that he was highly attracted to into his home, but he felt it was the right thing to do. He lived in a gated community with a home security system and private security patrols courtesy of his father's life insurance. Tina came over and brought Terry's coffee. You okay, sweetie? Tina asked, kneeling next to Terry. I am shaken but okay, Terry smiled at Tina, but went right back to watching the door. If you need anything, Greg here is the best. She patted Terry's hand and looked at Greg. She stood up and walked over to Greg and leaned over to whisper in his ear. I have never seen those 3 in here before. They're creeping me out. They've got their teeth filed into fangs and have those weird contacts in that make you look demonic. Greg nodded, and Tina went back to the counter, while giving the creeps a side-eye. "Let's go," Greg said, getting up and leaning over Terry. He reached down and moved the coffee drink over and whispered, "Act like you're sick to your stomach." Terry looked up at Greg like he was crazy and was about to protest before Terry continued, just to be on the safe side. He moved his thumb towards the 3 older boys now talking to Tina. Terry started to cough a bit and stood up really fast and ran for the bathroom with his hand covering his mouth. Greg turned and followed Terry, looking along the way at what the threesome were doing. They watched the bathroom door and now seemed no longer interested in Tina. Inside, he found Terry leaning against the sink. "What was that for?" "I think those 3 boys are here for you." Greg leaned against the sink. "What the hell is going on?" "I can't say." Terry looked like he was about to faint. "I came to you for help, but I'm not sure you have the answers. I'm also sorry if I dragged you into this mess." "Well, we can leave by way of the back door and get out of here. Then you are going to tell me," Greg said, going to the bathroom door and stepped out. He looked towards the trio, who Tina was still talking to. "Tina, can we use the back kitchen? I need some ice and stuff," he called out across the lobby. "Sure, sweetie," Tina said. She turned back to the fanged boys. "If you will excuse me, boys, it looks like I have a patient to see." Greg went back into the bathroom and grabbed a hold of Terry. The touch sent electricity through his body. He closed his eyes for a second, willing himself to focus on the job at hand. "Okay, act like you hit your head or something." He grabbed Terry's arm and pulled it around his neck to look like he was providing support. "This is going to be tricky if they are really here for you." "Why are you helping me?" Terry asked skeptically. "You don't know me." "Let's say I have a soft spot for hot guys," Greg said, groaning as he admitted it to him. "Me too," Terry laughed and acted like his head was hurting. "Let's get out of here." They made their way through the door, and Terry put up a good acting job of being injured. Tina was holding the door to the back room open and played along with his act of being hurt. Greg was amazed that she was able to pick up on this so well. "What the hell did you get into, Greg?" Tina asked once the door was closed. "One moment they were all over me, and now all they seem to care about is this one here. They kept asking me what was up. I told them I only knew you, and that you were someone new." "I am sorry," Terry said, leaning against the wall. "I can't tell you." "Come by after work, Tina," Greg said. "I'm going to take him home with me." "Oh, wow," Tina laughed. "You work fast when there is something serious going on, don't you?" Greg grinned as he went to the back door. "I wish. Just tell them he fell and hit his head, and that we are just getting him to lie down out of the way. Then come back and check, and then go back out and tell them we went out the back door to go to the hospital."
Episode 7. The Heretics. I'm Damien, and this is my story. By 1999, my devotion to Asmodeus was evolving and deepening. I continued with Mr. Davis, my 7th grade English teacher, but we've known each other a lot longer and some of the others for 5 years. His regular group of men had grown to 8 now, all ranging in age from 30 to 50. Then there were we 3 shared boys, Danny, Terry, and me, Damien. At 11, Terry remained the youngest with Danny and I, both 14. Well, okay, my real name is Tucker, but my ambitions to become a demon underlord in the abyss motivated me to use a more Asmodeus-specific name. It would give my swarm something better to call their master than Tucker. Well, it was a plan. I had some amazing plans laid out for my future. I would serve Asmodeus, and my gathered boys would serve me as my swarm. I met with the cult regularly, and that fueled my devotion. The pleasures Mr. Davis had given me never waned, but grew more intense. In time, we developed rituals that increased evil and wickedness and provided unadulterated pleasure and euphoria that enhanced our budding magic skills. But as time passed, I felt that I had a higher calling in Asmodeus's realm. I wasn't sure what it was or even where to get it. The Dark Lord was pulling me forward, even as a 14-year-old. My boy body had changed. I was just about 5'8". I was a natural at running, so my body was lithe, muscular, and sleek. I kept my thick, curly black hair at medium length. I was pretty for a boy, almost feminine-looking, with a walk that lifted my buttocks and tempted men towards forbidden pleasures. I liked turning men's heads, but as my higher Asmodeusic calling became more clear, I resisted becoming somebody's boy toy. Besides that, Asmodeus had gifted me with an incredible intellect. A professor in Mr. Davis's group guided me through all of Anton LaVey's writings and other occult and religious information. That gave me a greater range of knowledge in Asmodeusism, but my devotion to Asmodeus was unwavering. He was the demon I served. My role with the group gradually changed. I was no longer the curious boy, but began leading the group in invocations as a prelude to engaging Asmodeus. I just shared what I'd learned by experimenting with Baphomet, Balmalok, Beelzebub, to name a few. Mr. Davis and the others recognized my growing power, my incredible devotion to Asmodeus, and encouraged me. Under my precocious teen guidance, the rituals at Mr. Davis's worship space became more intense. I encouraged them to explore other demons and share their knowledge and experiences. I thought it would make us realize how deeply Asmodeus was already active and embedded in all levels of our culture, from movies to porn, church, to the highest levels of educational and governmental institutions. We didn't need to fight old battles, we discovered. We gradually moved away from blasphemy and from most religious imagery. Asmodeus had exposed the church as a dry husk of impotent hypocrisy and weak hypocrites. The battle with the Trinity was already over. I had the opportunity to convert several of my classmates, but Mr. Davis intervened. I know that you want to bring others in, but be patient. Remember, when you and I first met, I'd received a message from Queer Jim that you were open and ready. Asmodeus has a destiny for each of us. You knew it from the beginning, and he made sure that our paths crossed over and over. I asked, "These messages, how do they come into you, Mr. Davis?" They just float into my mind, sometimes a quiet voice, sometimes a sudden vision. I saw your boy face in a vision before I saw you in the car that Sunday. I follow the hints, and they always come true, like a sixth sense. Mr. Davis paused. Or a 666 sense. Remember when you had that first orgasm and invoked Hail Asmodeus over and over? Hail Asmodeus, Hail Asmodeus, Hail Asmodeus? You moaned and groaned over and over again, thanking your master for opening you to such pleasure. Your astounding response aroused me to incredible heights. Facilitating the first Asmodeustic orgasm in another is always a trip that no drug can exceed, although I couldn't resist the added bonus of the poppers that day. That encounter never would have happened without the message from Asmodeus. Your ecstasy allowed me entrance to where Queer Jim never got, as he has not been gifted by our master Tucker. Okay, I said. But is there a message for me now? Yes, an incredible one. First, don't bring your peers to Asmodeus. As much as it might tempt you, Asmodeus has greater vistas for you to conquer. You brought in Danny and Terry, but no more. And you won't be around here long enough to truly shape your peers. Plus, the ones you desire to convert are not like you. They lack your spiritual depth, and because of that, will not be discreet. Accept your exceptionalism as a gift. Is that all? I asked. I had no clue about where the next message would take me. No, Mr. Davis went on. There's more. The leading Asmodeusist in this country is named Gray Finley. Many call him the Arch-Asmodeusist. At any rate, his leadership and Asmodeusic devotion is widely recognized. I've never met him personally, but we keep in touch with coded chat in Boyruin. He's known about you since you came over. It's time for you to connect to him one-on-one in his temple. It's an honor bestowed on the few who have the plus potential to advance the realm. I am humbled that Asmodeus guided our first encounter. I now realize that it was part of greater, grander plan. Hail Asmodeus, Dark Prince of Lust! Hail Asmodeus, Dark Prince of Lust! I responded. I've never forgotten the first time you said those words, smiled Mr. Davis. 5 years ago when you were 9. The memory is still alive and vivid, he continued. Every detail is etched in my mind. Who can forget the ecstasy on your face when the phallus coaxed the first Asmodeusic dry orgasm from you? Yeah, I said. You set up the scene exactly right. The porn, the wine, stripping me, laying me across the altar, tying me down. The methodical touches of your fingertips and the toys bringing me higher and higher. I was getting more aroused every time I hailed Asmodeus. That was not a coincidence. I was led to you, and you to me. He went on. Your time with Gray will be for 2 weeks. The Brotherhood will make all the arrangements to get you there and provide a cover story. But what about my parents? Won't they be suspicious? They've been clueless so far about what I've done with your group, Mr. Davis. But 2 weeks away from them, I do need a roof over my head for a few years yet. Queer Jim has offered me a place, if he can make kiddie porn and pimp me out, but that's not my way. I only give myself in ritual. Mr. Davis laughed. That's what I meant by the cover story. We've already set up a fictional gay conversion survival trip for you. You'll be recommended for it by one of your teachers, Mr. Paul, who, by the way, belongs to another group of Asmodeusists near here. We've been waiting to tell you. Your parents will get information and be encouraged to check references. They'll understand that you'll not be in contact for at least 2 weeks. Brother, they'll want this for you, and will even pay for part of it. They'll support an experience that makes their son more confident. Little do they know. Fantastic planning, I observed. Thank the Brotherhood for me. No, thank Gray for his incredible leadership in the Asmodeustic movement. Asmodeusism is growing, it's expanding. He laughed. When you get to Gray's temple, you'll recognize some of the men who come discreetly to him. Actors, writers, politicians, artists, those who have chosen to serve Lord Asmodeus, go there to commune with Asmodeus and each other in one of Gray's many dark masses. The dark realm is growing, son. My parents totally bought into Brotherhood's fiction. When that happened, a demonic, wicked glee bubbled from my deepest core. Their spiritual journey and mine had certainly diverged, yet now they were part of mine. They were now more Judas than Jesus. I was thrilled that they had no idea what kind of evil they were supporting as the Christian thing to do, thinking they'd ungay me. They'd already given up making me attend church, but they still prayed for my soul. I snarled in delight. Their prayers were answered not by Jesus, but by the Lord of many names, the devil, Lucifer, Satan, Asmodeus. Their prayers bypassed their God and went to my Lord. You can't imagine what a turn-on that was when my truth-obsessed Christian parents became unwitting partners with the Lord of Lies. Instead of being sent off to a gay conversion camp, I'd be doing hardcore fag stuff. I couldn't resist setting up my secret altar in the room. I needed to worship Asmodeus for pulling my own parents into my evil perversions. I focused on my Asmodeustic icon, lit one small black candle, knelt down, and praised him for my redemption from their gods. I'd been conceived in my mother's womb, but now I grasped that I had been reborn, rebirthed into the realm of darkness. I promised him that I would give myself completely to whatever Gray asked me to do. Hail Asmodeus, master of all and ruler of my body and soul. No one can withstand your will and purpose. You enlist those who despise and hate you, and even they serve you. Take my soul and give it to Gray, your master of depravity. I cannot resist. I will not resist. Rebirth me in Gray's lairs of iniquity. Entrance me now, fill me now, create my pleasure, share my pleasure. Hail Asmodeus. Asmodeus answered my prayer by giving me an intense, prolonged, no-hands orgasm. The thought of it would sustain me as I waited impatiently to go. I was eager for what I'd soon be exploring in Gray Finley's wilderness, and couldn't wait to go. Soon I was on a plane to Maine for the so-called wilderness experience. The 2 others destined for Gray were already on the ground when my plane landed. Gray's assistant met me and introduced himself as Seth. We then boarded a private, windowless bus for New York City to where we were to meet Gray. Seth boarded first and opened a door to the interior. We stepped into a dark, dimly lighted chamber, obviously a mobile shrine for the worship and honor of Lord Asmodeus. 4 leather reclining chairs surrounded a pedestal. An altar, replete with inverted cross, skull, chalice, and skull, stood at the end of the space, illuminated from above by a beam of red light. Asmodeustic iconography and homoerotic paintings adorned the walls. Seth motioned us to our seats. Seth was a dark blonde with stunning good looks, early 30s, I guessed. His flexible body, graceful stride, and smooth gestures were that of trained ballet dancer, so I thought. I asked later. He was trained in dance at a small college in Minnesota, where he'd also converted. As soon as we were all in our seats, Seth stood up and unbuttoned his thin silk shirt. He revealed a shaved chest with dark nipples. He was confident and assured, and I immediately felt a bond of complete trust with him. He toyed with the pentagram amulet on a silver chain and made intense eye contact with each of us. "Hail Asmodeus," he said softly. "This trip will be several hours long, and we won't waste time." He paused, focused on us. Gray asked us to use this salutation in preparation for tonight. "Hail Asmodeus. Hail the demon Baphomet, who will be our new master before the dawn." Seth invited us to invoke. "Say it 3 times with me." We replied 3 times in surprising unison. "Hail Asmodeus. Hail the demon Baphomet, our new master before the dawn. Hail Asmodeus. Hail the demon Baphomet, our new master before the dawn. Hail Asmodeus. Hail the demon Baphomet, our new master before the dawn." You won't regret accepting Gray's invitation, and of course you'll willingly let him lead you. Not many Asmodeusists are summoned to take such an odyssey with Lucifer's most depraved lords. You are here because Asmodeus recognized your innate talents early on, maybe at 7, 8, or 9. He sensed you. He caught your growing scent. You appealed to the Lord of Lust. Members of the Brotherhood have kept Gray informed of your every step. Whatever you've done this far has been at Asmodeus's influence, and your reward is now coming. Your youthfulness and allure will allow you to serve him for many productive years. However, don't allow your stunning good looks to make you arrogant. You have much to absorb before your bodies will be fully in his service, and you'll learn to use your good looks to assist in Asmodeus's triumph. He went on, "Now I ask you to open your shirts and circle your nipples softly." I was wearing a tight-fitting black Givenchy shirt. I unbuttoned it to my waist and pulled it out of jeans. I began to caress softly and arouse my sensitive erogenous chest tabs. Now that we are all soaring with his energy, it's proper that I lead you in now, a supplication to praise the malevolent Prince of Darkness. Keep circling and repeat the phrases after me, brothers. Hail Asmodeus, Lord of darkness and lust, magnificent serpent of impure temptation. We have given our souls to you freely and without reservation. You have freed us from all guilt and shame. You have given us the forbidden fruit, and we have eaten. You have liberated us from fear and from selfish self-preservation / you have revealed hell as a place of unending pleasure. We are ready for Grey Finley, archpriest in your temple. Use us to seduce sons of Adam from light into darkness. Bring us deeper into the unholy mystery and carnality of possession. We will embody your rule. Bestow it upon us, your minions. Hail Asmodeus! Hail Asmodeus! Hail Asmodeus! Again! Seth led us through the same response, not once but twice more. Our nipples swelled with the dark energy surging in us and through us. All four of us fell silent. What I'd done with Mr. Davis was a perfect prelude for this, yet nothing that I'd ever experienced over 5 years with my brothers at home was so eloquent, so lyrical, and so rich as what I'd just done with Seth. I could hardly contain the cravings for Asmodeus churning in me. I desperately needed to kneel and worship completely. I craved his presence in me. Hail Asmodeus! Was shrieking from every cell of my body and firing through every synapse in my brain. Seth broke the spell. Each of us is committed to expanding Asmodeus's hegemony and control. Only Grey knows what special role each of you will play for our insidious master. Be aware, though, that Grey has been obsessed with the demon Baphomet lately. I think that's where he will start with you, but I'm not totally sure. If that's his direction tonight, I guarantee that you will experience Asmodeus with Baphomet on a level you've never imagined. Seth's hint, or tease, created a knot of demonic pulsing in my groin that radiated into my cock and writhed in my sex tunnels. Logan and Drew were feeling it too, with the same ravenous hunger to worship and be possessed with Asmodeus. Seth was attuned to our growing excitement and invited us to go higher. Then hail with me again 3 more times. The words were on fire at my core, and further stoked my already white-hot desire. They broke through my throat and exploded over my lips. Hail Asmodeus! Hail the demon Baphomet, our new master before the dawn. Hail Asmodeus! Hail the demon Baphomet, our new master before the dawn. Hail Asmodeus! Hail the demon Baphomet, our new master before the dawn. I wondered. What could possibly come next? I was ready. Seth took a moment to let the passion subside. Now back to you 3. He looked at us directly. Tucker, Drew, and Logan, it's time for you to tell more about yourselves. Just say what comes into our minds. Before you start, though, you have 3 important things in common. You're all 14. You are theistic Asmodeusists. You have proven Asmodeusic talent, and you are gay. What's important now is that each of you share why you think Grey has chosen you. I started first. I'm Tucker, and I've been Asmodeus's since I was 9. I've had some incredible Asmodeusic experiences already, and I am totally open to more. Reasons? I'm just guessing here, but I might have been chosen for 3 reasons. First, I've experimented with many demons. Second, I've gloried in undermining of religion, like desecration of churches and schools, and I lured 1 priest and 1 megachurch preacher to kneel and worship Lord Asmodeus in my boy parts. Totally thrilling. Third, I have sown the seed of curiosity for Asmodeus among boys with pictures and pornography. And Asmodeus kept track of that? Yes, he has, Seth answered. But you didn't mention your special talent. You are a gifted writer. Your writing will bring many new and willing sons to Asmodeus. You'll soon be writing screenplays for an authentic genre of gay Asmodeusic porn films. Asmodeus has already infiltrated the gay porn industry. Actors, directors, and production staff already invoke him. They are waiting for someone like you. Asmodeus will guide the process when the time is right. The Brotherhood has already enlisted financing and production staff for the production. Of course, they will go far beyond today's Asmodeusic poppers training vids. Your skills, Tucker, will glorify Asmodeus to a wider, waiting, and willing audience. Really, Seth, I love porn, and you're right. I haven't seen anything produced yet that comes close to my encounters with the real Asmodeus. I know that there's a hunger for it out there, and if true Asmodeusists write it, direct it, and perform in it, I accept it as my mission in the realm of darkness. I paused and repeated with a Seth's invocation, Hail Asmodeus! Hail the demon Baphomet, our new master! Hail Asmodeus! Hail the demon Baphomet, our new master! Hail Asmodeus! Hail the demon Baphomet, our new master! Sitting beside me was an incredibly handsome teen with long blonde hair, a long lithe body, a fair complexion, blue-eyed with an innocent boyish face, and glistening teeth. Seth nodded to him to speak next. And I'm Drew. I had my first feeling for Asmodeus at 7, but it only started to get real when I was 11. I won't share everything that's happened in the 3 years since then, but I'm sure Asmodeus has kept track of my artwork. I've drawn designs for altars, for inverted crosses, and sketched perverted versions of the Star of David. My paintings of Asmodeusic orgies are so realistic that brothers purchase to hang in their chambers. Brothers have described visions of demons and the netherworld that I've been able to draw them accurately. I've made patterns for tattoos, amulets, and collars. I'm planning to craft Asmodeusic BDSM gear once I know more about that scene. I'm sure that my work has deepened men's devotion to Asmodeus and encouraged others to convert to him. It all makes me feel powerful in a demonic way. Drew went on. My skills, or maybe my genius, both come from him, and I use it, hone it, and develop it to bring honor and glory to his name. And like you, Tucker, all I can say right now is the invocation Seth just taught us. Hail Asmodeus! Hail the demon Baphomet, our new master! Hail Asmodeus! Hail the demon Baphomet, our new master! Hail Asmodeus! Hail the demon Baphomet, our new master! Logan was a very attractive African-American, over 6 feet tall, long, sinewy legs, strikingly cute face framed by closely cropped hair. Logan's every glance, motion, and utterance were demonically sensual. When his eyes met mine, we bonded at once and shared a passion that bristled with the craving for evil in each other. He could very easily make me his mortal jack of spades. Drew, I was sure, was also feeling it from Logan. His cock quaked not just with desire, but with incredible desire to venerate Asmodeus more fully. Asmodeus could possess Logan and take me on the altar, as brutally as he wanted. The synergy among us procreated a new, vibrant Asmodeusic family, brothers sired by the same venal father, Lord Asmodeus. Through Grey, our individual devotion would merge onto a whole new dimension. Seth smiled at Logan, who spoke next. He took a deep breath and chose his words carefully. To make a long story short, my father facilitated my entry into Asmodeusism. Your father? I asked. Yes. He and my mother were divorced when I was 5, and I lived with her most of the time. He spent time with me, mainly as an obligation, since he was preoccupied with a demanding medical practice. Sometimes interns from the hospital would be at his apartment, but I never thought of him as gay. Soon after their divorce, my mother married a professor who taught ancient cultures and religions at the University of Pennsylvania. When I was 8, I was already a voracious reader, and he let me access any book I wanted in his personal library. He was aware that I'd gravitated to the occultism section. That included rare and one-time banned books of ancient rituals that he'd found in obscure libraries and bought from collectors of occult esoterica. And of course, he owned books by Crowley and LaVey. He encouraged my curiosity. He translated pages for me that I didn't understand, and he cautioned me, don't take these things too seriously. There is no God, there is no Satan, there are no angels, and there are no demons. Spirituality, whether it's light or dark, is pure myth. Anything that seems real, son, is just your own projection. Accept that. I really didn't buy into his rejection of the unseen powers. When I tried some of the rituals, I sensed something or someone powerful around me. I was attracted to it. Uncanny it was. I spoke to it. I experimented with many names trying to engage it. When I was 12 and crossed the threshold to a testosterone-laden puberty, I first tried out the name Asmodeus. That was it. Other names roused other dark energies, but whenever I used that name Asmodeus, my thoughts were pure evil, and my pleasure was incredible. I secretly put a primitive altar together and invented my own Asmodeusic rites. On my own, I professed my loyalty to Asmodeus and offered myself to him. My multiple, momentous Asmodeus-inspired orgasms sealed the pact between my soul and my new master, Lord Asmodeus. And, Logan continued, by the way, my stepfather was wrong. Asmodeus is not a myth, not a projection. My lord is real, alive, pulsating, and I am his. Hail. Soon after that, I moved back to my own father's Tony apartment in Philly, Logan went on. I came into his bedroom late at night and surprised him. I was shocked that he was naked and was kneeling at his own elaborate Asmodusic altar, set up in a closet that he otherwise kept locked. He stood up, embarrassed, and started to explain. I interrupted him and blurted out, "Hail Asmodeus, Father. I worship him too." We bonded immediately as father and son, becoming closer and closer to each other through our love for Asmodeus. He prepped me for weeks. I was particularly intrigued by his connection to Beelzebub, and said I would discover that potent demon servant of Asmodeus later. He introduced me to multiple Asmodusic rituals, and with the skill of a physician, identified part of my body to touch and caress for heightened awareness of Asmodeus's presence. Those first sessions ended in mutual masturbation, fueled by our frenzied praise of Lord Asmodeus. I knew that we would soon have the Asmodusic coupling, and every cell of my body waited for the sublime iniquity of Asmodusic penetration. Then one night we finally invoked together in the dark of the new moon, and had our first incestuous bare Asmodusic manboy sex. His tongue anointed my entrance, his lips arousing every nerve to incredible heights. Then he entered. Face to face, we became one being in Asmodeus, body, mind, spirit. When he hailed Asmodeus and released his depraved mass of Asmodusic seed into me, I realized that we were not just father and son, but were full brothers, partners in shameless and depraved immorality. Then my father invited me to enter him and seal our union. I praised Asmodeus and all demons when my body released the teeming seed of darkness into him. After that introduced me to other fathers and sons who also practiced Asmodeusism. I hope I can tell you about those gatherings during our time with Gray. Hail Asmodeus! Drew, Seth, and I all answered. Hail Asmodeus! Seth went on. It's clear that you all want to connect more intensely. Are you ready for the next step, right here in the bus, before we get to New York, now that you've shared about yourselves? Logan answered, I don't speak for everyone, but I'm open for anything. Drew and I nodded in agreement. What about the driver? Seth laughed softly. Logan, he's one of us and has been for a long time. He accepts his role as at the wheel to get us to Gray. Then I invite you to strip down. I have a treat for you that will let you soar in evil pleasure before we arrive. I'm thrilled that Gray asked me to share it. We eagerly doffed our clothes, and so did Seth.
Episode 8, The Candyman. Richard of Shrewsbury, the Duke of York, and his older brother, maybe a king and maybe not a king, King Edward V, both commonly known as the Princes in the Tower, both in England and at Pooh's Tower in the Isles Castle, were trying to wake the imp as gently as possible to avoid a thrashing. Relaying messages was part of their duties as hall boys among Pooh's servants. Experience had taught the two preteens that Pooh could be cranky and swift with corporal punishment when awakened. Thrashings, floggings, canings, bare-butted spankings and pinchings were all a possibility and dependent on the severity of the perceived infraction. Other servants hovering in the background included Willie Lincoln, late son of Abraham Lincoln, who was now in charge of Pooh's porcelain chamber pot. Agent Plague had been sent to booger Willie and give him typhoid, just so Pooh could have a celebrity chamber pot attendant to brag about. There had been a human chamber pot in use until Willie's taking, but Scotty had been promoted to boot boy. Ptolemy XIII was by the trunks eavesdropping. The 14-year-old would have been doomed to marrying his older sister Cleopatra and being co-ruler of Egypt had not Pooh graciously drowned the adolescent pharaoh in the Nile River after having him polish the swords of two high-ranking Roman centurions. He then brought the Egyptian to the Isle to serve him as a houseboy. The royal brothers did manage to rouse Pooh without too much trouble. As he was under the silk sheets with agents fourscore, Matt, Mike, Mark and Milo Henderson, the imp was likely in a very sated slumber, so woke up Perky. Pooh had been summoned to the underground cavern where Candyman wasted away. He needed to give his master some updates and find an excuse to delay feeding him Thomas. He forced himself to pee in the chamber pot so he could scream at Willie to attend to his chore or suffer a spanking. Pooh believed strongly in mistreating the help. He believed it helped build their character. Passing the dungeons, Pooh stopped at Tatter's cell, opened a bag and pulled out a bloody foot, which he threw to the zombie. Real fresh, babe. Freshly thawed out anyway. Belonged to that dumb buck-toothed kid what fell off the roller coaster watching me fight those goddamn tweaker dwarfs in Texas last year. That's what being nosy will get you. Oh, I got that Grayson boy out of it too. I call him Bendy, because he bends really good. He's still got all his limbs. He's a contortionist, so I figured the kid would be lots of fun to have around. The dwarfs damn sure enjoyed him until I snatched him up. And the instructor's here too, as he's already made agent. Was at the bottom of his class at the academy, but that's a good thing. Ha! He misses the dwarfs sometimes, though. Lots of hanky-panky was going on in that trailer before Agent Bam Bam clubbed them all to death. Hey, did you hear we have a new donkey agent? Yeah, he's real popular with the boys. They ride him, he rides them. Those TikTok videos have the boys getting into all sorts of strange stuff, taking really big ones, and you know how big donkeys are in that department. Water sports, getting in touch with their inner selves. The donkey was popular with Dionysos' gang before the swarm ass-napped him and brought him here via Cam. Apparently, Cam had run off with the donkey from the lagoon to go to Tijuana so they could get into show business, but he was ordered to drop the donkey off here as an act of sabotage. I've been calling Damien out over it. He's just trying to start a war between us and the Greeks to keep me distracted. I want to be mad at Cam, but he's still welcome here. My sweetie is one of the rare demon underlings I'll allow on the property. I wish I'd gotten to him before Damien did, so he could be here all the time. Be one of my boys full-time instead of a grab-a-snack. Remember those girls we sold to the sheikh before you got locked down? They escaped to Eastern Europe, put out a hit on me. Kill Pooh is all, they say. Let's see. Finally got Delicatus into rehab. It's costing me a pretty penny. Agent Songbird hooked up with the sea turtle right after Delicatus shipped out. That's going to be some drama when he gets back. Look, Tats, I'm heading to see the Candyman right now, and I'm going to plea for your release. We'll have you out of there and back running around eating the bodies of the boys, whose corpses I don't want found in no time. Kisses. See you in a bit, love, fawned Pooh. The stench of the decay was almost unbearable. The catacombs, the rubble, the Crawleys, the Candyman. Everything had gone south for the Dark One after Tugger's mission to the Branch Davidian compound in Waco had gone all to hell. He had a bountiful objective in that 3 boys had already been corrupted by the freaks running around the compound and just needed to die, so that they could be taken to Candyman and fed to him. He found the children of cultists and acolytes of false messiahs to be quite delectable. Behind Tugger's back, an agent of Ammon snuck in and set fire to everything. In the flames, that agent took the perished boys' souls right from under Tugger. It was a rookie mistake to make, and Tugger wasn't a rookie. There would be consequences. In 1803, Pooh, who wanted to get Tugger away from Candyman and the tension at the Isle, invited his lover on a mission to the Charenton Asylum in France. They were retconning a possessed boy named Pierre, who was being terrorized by a demon lord named Pazuzu. The attendants were joyfully taking up the straight-jacketed kid's tendered ass and mouth, but the turning the head around and levitating above his cot had spooked them. Plus, Pierre was spitting their semen at them and insulting their mothers. The immortal pair decided it was time to steal Pierre from Pazuzu and reap him for Candyman, who would be appeased over capturing a fallen boy from another demon lord. Pierre's possession and whoring made him a far better catch than any boy with the Branch Davidians, even the ones who escorted their little sisters to David Koresh's bed. But Candyman's Waco judgment came down too soon. It was harsh, with Tugger stripped of his designation and banished from the Isle. Unbeknownst to the 2 agents, Candyman was getting rather jealous of his pet Pooh spending so much time with Tugger, so found an opportunity to separate them. Enraged and feeling betrayed, Tugger snapped Pierre's neck and grabbed his soul, which he delivered directly to Pazuzu as an offering. For his gratitude, the demon lord gave Tugger to the pit demons, who comprised his legion, to be used as a receptacle for their multiple tentacle-shaped appendages. Tugger ended up blaming Pooh for it all, not pleading with Candyman hard enough, not stopping him from fleeing to Pazuzu, and not knifing his way through the legion to rescue his damsel lover. The latter being impossible, as he could not enter another demon lord's territory without invitation. To do so meant instant immortal death. Tugger knew that. Yet he's begun to haunt Pooh through the pink mist. Normally, his being imprisoned in Pazuzu's realm would make that impossible, but the long-term exposure to the pink mist left remnants on the lost boy's soul, giving him some connection still. Thus, he manages to get weak messages to Pooh. After these events, Candyman fell into a deep melancholy. He went down to the catacombs with his crawly things, and has never come back up. As the boy ruiner fell himself into ruin, Pooh began, hatching a plan to take over the realm and end Candyman's reign and mastery over him. With the Candyman unable to leave the cavern and unable to see the world beyond it any longer, the ancient being relied completely on Pooh to bring him the souls of dirty boys to feed on. It was the only thing sustaining him. With his master's growing helplessness, Pooh saw a path to revenge. Candyman had completely ruined Pooh by 1720, savagely raped him, framed his friend Tatters for the deed, spread rumours that Pooh and Tatters were lovers, which was true, but Tatters never abused him. Now immortal, Pooh had served the dark beast as his pet for 303 years. In 1714, Pooh's parents had died of cholera aboard the ship on their voyage to the colonies, where his father's father had established a plantation. The 6-year-old boy was left frail and sickly, but survived. His widowed grandfather was highly displeased with having to take over raising the child, so mostly left his care in the hands of slaves. That was all right with Pooh, because avoiding his mean grandfather was a matter of survival. Now he avoided the Candyman as much as possible, slowly starving the ancient being of his ruined boys, but at times he had to make an appearance. The old one still maintained some strengths Pooh did not yet want to test, so he obediently stepped over rubble and approached his master's throne. "Come, my pretty pet, let me touch your feathery blonde hair, so soft and sweet, like the wings of an angel framing its perfect face, and your moist, pouty, kissable lips. Sit on my lap so that we may kiss, child. Does your hole crave my fingers? Are you wearing those panties I like?" softly spoke the Candyman. After about an hour of making out with Candyman and helping the old one achieve a disappointing orgasm with his hand on the decaying one's flaccid cock, intercourse was no longer possible for the Candyman, who in better days would have had Pooh stripped down and bent over the throne screaming for his master to go harder as he yanked the chains on the boy's nipple clamps and swatted his butt cheeks with a leather paddle. It was time to get down to business. "Sire, when can I release Tatters from the dungeon? He's promised not to eat any of your ruined boys before they're served to you again." That was unusual to begin with. He'd never shown an appetite for spiritual flesh before, said Pooh. "Where is the boy Thomas you were to bring to me?" coaxed Candyman. "It's complicated. The Nazis have multiple demon lords backing them. Slipping in and snatching Thomas away has become a delicate operation. I know you hunger. I've my eyes on a boy that I know will fuel your furnace, my lord," replied Pooh. "My pet, bring me the boy Thomas, and then we'll discuss Tatters after I've fed." As he disengaged from the Candyman's embrace, who fondled his favourite boy's ass one last time as he slid down, Pooh began his walk down the grim passageway, deep in thought, and undisturbed by his master's hands having caressed his body during the entire time he was upon his lap. After all, he was used to that after 303 years as an immortal, plus the one mortal year Candyman pretended to be human and molested him. Pooh had other plans for Thomas. Never in time had the Candyman been so weakened and ripe for overthrow. No longer able to see the above or the around, the now or the then, the what is or what was, the evil one is unaware his precious Pooh has been feeding him less, while raising an army against him. But Pooh had rules to follow in harvesting souls. Good boys could not enter the Isle. No, the Isle was the home to boys who had died during corrupt behaviours and then snatched up by one of the Candyman's couriers, like Pooh, who in normal times would feed them to Candyman. Inside the creature, their souls would endure unspeakable pain and misery for eternity, or until the Candyman perished. Now the corruption and killing of the boys was for Pooh's benefit. He needed soldiers for his rebellion. Candyman's starvation had made him urgent to feed on a special morsel like Thomas. Pooh was unsure of how he even knew of Thomas's existence, unless that boy's ruin had been calculated well before Candyman's decline. Unsaid was that both the demon lord and his pet knew that Thomas alone could replenish the dying ancient being back to his former majesty. Had Candyman set this all into motion ages ago? Centuries ago, the Candyman had patiently taken his time grooming Pooh, for he knew that Pooh had more potential than any boy he'd ever pursued. Even before he was born, Candyman had begun his machinations for Pooh. Later, he would corrupt the boy, unmercifully use his body which he shared with his monstrous underlings, degrade and humiliate him, allow him to suffer at the hands of his sadistic grandfather, then end him during a moment of absolute despair so he could be brought to the Isle and serve a new master, as the perfect broken boy. They end up making the best pets when disciplined correctly and without mercy. The Candyman began his direct debasement of the prepubescent English lad named Charles Reginald Atkinson, but nicknamed Pooh, by sending a minion to abuse the child during his sleep. Pooh was 9 years old then, still alive. He'd be only 3 years older when the Candyman finished up the job in person and wholly ruined him and drove him mad. The then mortal boy remembered from long ago telling Tatters, a field slave and his closest confidant at Grandfather Atkinson's honeysuckle plantation on the South Carolina coast, about the many nights he was being despoiled in his dreams, showing a sexual knowledge the child should not normally have. So the giant dark-skinned man believed every word Pooh disclosed. In fact, Tatters had heard many tales around the fire about such wicked nightly visitors and the impious liberties they took with the sleeping innocent. He crossed himself as Pooh began his story. I woke up in a pitch darkness, trying to reach out to the light. I realised a heavy pressure was on my chest and that I couldn't move. I'd had enough night terrors, while in the cholera's embrace, to know what was going on. But even knowing it was just a waking dream couldn't keep my pulse steady, as I became aware of the sinister figure straddling my chest, pressing on me with a heaviness that stopped my breathing and prevented me from screaming for help. I suddenly heard a low growl, almost like a wolf in hunger, and the room lit as if by candlelight, although I could see no source. What I could see sent a new wave of fear and revulsion. The figure I was dreaming on my chest was illuminated, frightening, foul, grotesque, like a misshapen man stunted in growth, naked with an erection, and dead in its large round eyes. No hair, its skin greenish in hue and scaly, limbs short, its ears pointed and quite large, small bat wings flitted on the thing's back. The creature's mouth was overly large and bore sharp grey teeth. 2 horns protruded from its forehead. A long, forked tail swung above its buttocks, its chest ripped and bearing 2 abnormally large nipples, its fingers possessing long talons. "Oh, my Tatters, I was in such a fright!" cried Pooh. Tatters pulled the boy to him and sat him on his lap with his arms wrapped protectively around the still-speaking lad. Pooh laid his head against the black man's shoulder and continued. It was all so vivid. I could feel its ass on my chest, could even feel its large ballsack resting on me. I reminded myself that it was a dream. The deep hunger growl was still sounding, and the surreal light proved that. But there was nothing dreamlike about how vivid the sensations and sight of this fiend was. It slowly stood to its knees, its arse rising off my chest, but the intense pressure was still there. I felt like I couldn't breathe. Tatters could see that Pooh was now blushing as he prepared to tell the next part. It was fully naked Tatters, and in an aroused state. I could see that the enormous member swinging between its legs was hard. I felt a very real sickness in my stomach, looking at his long engorged, noticeably throbbing cock, wondering how it was going to be put to use. On board the ship, I'd spied men coaxing women to do certain carnal acts, so part of me knew what was coming. I tried looking away, but my paralysis extended so deep I couldn't even blink, let alone avert my gaze. Some distant part of me, buried in self-loathing and the sheer horror tied in with the night terror, was a little interested to see how he had planned to use me. I was scared and now ashamed by my curiosity. And again, the deep fear with this dream hit me. As impossible as it was, it all seemed too real. My nightmare brought its groin towards my face. Its cockhead was quite pronounced, like the tip of a large red mushroom. Its foreskin was bunched up at the below the tip, not pulled back even though my assailant was hard. I could smell its ripeness and see the smegma formed at the tip. The thing's shaft was darker than the rest of the flesh, but still incredibly green. It seemed like we were like this for a lifetime before it leaned his body forward, his maypole approaching my mouth. A hungry and sadistic expression crossed his face, the smile of a ravager, a monster. So incredibly out of place was his cock against my little boy's face that it was more surreal than the increasingly more unnerving growl or the flickering candlelight with no source. I tried to cry out. I strained so hard to turn my face that I got a nasty cramp from my chest to my ear. The searing pain just continued to build, but I hardly felt it in my trapped need to escape. My heart pounded louder and faster than ever. I went completely hysterical. My mind was a cacophony of undelivered pleas for help and cries of disgust and horror. I felt his cock on my lips. his bunched little foreskin touching my mouth like a kiss. I went numb, my mind suddenly silent, retreating. This wasn't real, I told myself, over and over in the now numbing silence. All I could hear was the deep low growl, and the one thought, this isn't real, this is a dream. He reached down and forced my mouth open. I felt his cold hand on my jaw. I felt his frenulum continue to brush on my lower lip. Then he pushed deep inside my mouth. As my mouth filled, fantastically, my fear was gone and replaced by a hunger for the creature's shaft. I began to service him with an unnatural skill, taking his full length into my throat. Somehow preternaturally, I now possessed the oral skills of an experienced harlot. He held tightly onto my hair and kept my face buried in his groin, pumping back and forth, until a nasty, vile, delicious seed flooded my mouth. My eyes rolled back into my head, and I moaned with wantonness, as his cream filled my mouth and escaped past my lips to dribble down my chin and neck. He gave me a lewd grin and slowly pulled his cock out of my mouth, but held my chin with his cold hand, keeping my mouth forced open. Then he began pissing. I didn't hesitate. I accepted his yellow stream and gulped as much down as I could. My loins were on fire, and I was squeezing my thighs together as I welcomed his defilement. The deliciousness of it all. He then grabbed the back of my head and pulled me to its lips. The creature's long, forked tongue prodded my mouth, sending shivers throughout my body. Breaking our unholy kiss, he looked into my eyes and grunted out, "Sweet one, I am Dweorg, servant of the Candyman, deflowerer of boys, preparer of the damned, soon to be the tempest in your teapot. I will return to you every fortnight, and you will pleasure me with your pretty mouth, whelp. Your desires were there all along. You fell with the first cock in your mouth." He slid my gown over my head and laid me down. We hungrily kissed, and our mouths explored each other's body. We were as lovers then, this monster and I. Needing no force, I willingly took him back in my mouth and suckled him until he filled my mouth with his horrible, delicious seed again, a seed I now craved. I wanted more of him. I wanted to milk him with my mouth forever. Then it was morning. My jaws ached, my body trembled. Its taste still lingered in my mouth, and there was a crust around my lips, and the front of my gown was sopping wet. But how could that be, Tatters? How could I still taste its juices and its traces on my face with it being a dream? On the creature's 10th visit, he ripped Pooh's nightshirt off, forced him face down and raped him. Pooh didn't resist the rape, but instead humped himself back against his rapist's plunges. In the time ahead, Dweorg invited a second of its kind to share Pooh in his night terrors each fortnight. The 9-year-old began to count the days between the nocturnal visits he was no longer frightened of but yearned for. The Candyman would allow his minions to use the boy for their amusements for the next 2 years. Pooh would be introduced to many devilish depravities. They'd taken to calling him their boy bitch. In his dreams, Pooh allowed them to do to him as they desired, and would crawl down and kiss their hoofs and drink their urine from a bowl on the floor in gratitude for loving him once they'd finished abusing him. In his waking hours, the boy dismissed it all as disturbed dreams, while ignoring the dried semen on his lips and buttocks, the paddle marks, the scratches, the restraint bruises around his wrists and ankles, and so much more. Then it was the most unholy one's time to enter Pooh's waking life. The aisle was in an uproar with the cacophony of wagging tongues and Pooh's shrill screeches. Pooh had gotten the 11-year-old immortal trans boy Ryan Miller Scott pregnant and was not at all happy about it. The servants were trembling as Pooh frantically paced his chamber, yelling, "How does such a thing happen? Do you know how rarely I opt for pussy? It was the absinthe, every damn time. Got me hooked on normie sex with Daleen too. Be damned that Moulin Rouge. Curse Quasimodo for dragging me there. I've a mind to deanimate that old ghoul." Daleen, at 13, an older woman with her wily ways, tall, lean, small-breasted, boyish, those colt legs and round ass doing the can-can in front of my sotted face, catching me in a manly butch moment, enticing me with her wag, making me mount her on that swing, while her employer, that arthritic Spaniard Ola, boned my arse. I still have a crick. Good thing Quasimodo was nearby to help hide my shame, so he has some uses. Hung Daleen from a bell tower until I could bring her here. I didn't need any ghosts in the mortal world spilling my Moulin Rouge beans, thank you. Absinthe makes me do all kinds of unnatural acts. I'm a backdoor boy, ask Ola. Well, my backdoor most of the time, but even with a girl she's to top. obviously with a toy, of course. In my drunken state, I must have mistaken Sugar Baby's pinkness for the mist and just stumbled in. Yes, that's what happened. I'm sure of it. Oh, I swear to never drink again. Absinthe, anyway. The unorthodox acts it leads to are unforgivable. I need to smack someone. Here, smack this one, said Edward, as he pushed his little brother Richard towards Pooh. The Mad Imp was going to be a baby daddy to Agent Sugar Baby now, which meant additional responsibilities for his servant staff and converting one of the tower's smaller closets, preferably the one most distant from his bedchamber where the brooms were kept, into a nursery. Babies are tiny, so the brooms shouldn't need to be moved. Mummy Sugar Baby could share his bed and visitors. That wasn't exactly a new thing, it just would be more of a regular thing now, so not much of a problem there. He very well couldn't let the pregnant boys stay in the barracks. Then again, well, he'd think about it more. Oh, catastrophes. If Sugar Baby breaks water in my bed the same time the bat is pissing, we're all going to drown, Pooh lamented. Remaining in the barracks it would be. Once born, lewd Uncles Dweirg and Moorcock can watch the nursery, so that should help. They can sit on the baby and muffle its cries, thought Pooh. Lamar's classes, he suddenly yelled. Willie, you need to sign up for Lamar's classes forthwith. A doula class too. I still want that chamber pot kept emptied though. Richard, get back over here. In Candyman's realm, many things were possible. If they so chose, those identifying as boys remained boys in the spirit world, regardless of their biological makeup. A soul is eternal, and how that soul feels about themselves is more important than the blip of physicality they'll possess on the mortal plane. Sex assignment is provisional, identity is permeable, desire ambiguous. Obeying my commands unconditional, Pooh was fond of chanting. The Isle's masses had boys, who had been mortal-born without the matching parts. Whether mismatched, mashed up, missing, or what, reproductive parts are transitory. They do not define the soul, who may exist in any manner it chooses, even while that soul remains as the mortal it once represented. While on the Isle, as in existence itself, it remains breathable in form and fashion. At times even Pooh had transfigured into having female parts for certain assignments where he'd need to have normie intercourse. I've the mannerisms, the wardrobe, the looks already. Just need the titties. Small ones as big ones are awkward. Big nips, though, and the bajingo, nice and tight, to be all set, Pooh would instruct the pink mist. With the exception of Daleen, the mistresses of mayhem were once mortal boys, who chose to become girls after dwelling on the Isle. Their spirit bodies fully transformed and became females. The mistresses were now estranged from the realm, but it had nothing to do with their chosen identities. It had to do with their leader, Daleen. The other chick Pooh had been banging, and someone he wanted to bang more, were it not for the kill Pooh order Daleen had issued. One could not keep potential assassins in the court, so they were banished. Back in 769, Pooh had gotten into a tight spot with a djinn in Arabia, and had to ransom some of the mistresses to a Bedouin tribe to pay his way out of it. The imp had planned to return to the Isle and grab some gold to get the mistresses released, but once there, had gotten distracted. That was 16 years ago. Daleen didn't like the disrespect shown to her mistresses, which led to their current outcast status and desire for revenge. Daleen did not recruit from within the trans boys for obvious reasons. She focused on the boys who wanted to be girls coming to the Isle, not the girls wanting to be boys. Not even the lesbian boys were allowed into the special force. Before being reaped, most of the trans boys had either not started puberty or may have been on puberty blockers. A few were undergoing hormonal treatments, both of those being dependent upon the medical advances seen in their times. There were no developed breasts, deep voices, or excessive hair. However, due to their age and no surgical intervention, the trans boys still maintained their female sex reproductive organs. At times, they were intersex, so those organs didn't fit in with a binary sex classification. None of the ones on the Isle had undergone any reassignment surgery during mortal life. There were some partial alterations to anatomy, such as in the cases of the castrati twins Laurent and Louis Moreau, agents Tit and Tat, who had their testicles removed while being mortal children. The removal of their testes, however, only stopped most production of the hormone testosterone, resulting in preventing them from ever producing sperm and giving them more feminine attributes. Their sexual desires remained intact and were quite ravenous. though they had to exist with smaller sexual organs than they would naturally have developed once reaching puberty, a fate almost all of the prepubescent boys on the Isle were left with unless they chose spiritual alterations. They preferred taking the passive role in intercourse, as was their natural inclination even before being altered, so it was not an issue for them. It was rare that a pregnancy occurred on the Isle, as the boys tended not to have become fertile and ready to reproduce when they were killed and brought to the realm. As seen with Sugar Baby, however, sometimes there is an egg lying in wait to be fertilized. One of Pooh's sperm found that egg, so a baby would be born to the immortal trans Sugar Baby and the demidemon Pooh. In Candyman's realm, preteen and adolescent homosexual boys were the primary targets, as it was the Ancient One's personal preference. Biologically sexed girls, who identified as boys and had homosexual, bisexual or pansexual tendencies, were completely accepted as boys and were part of his collection. Boys were boys, and that was it. Most of the demon lords employed heterosexual child sex predators, which were the vast majority of pedophiles and pederasts, so more easily come by. Those demon lords weren't fully heterosexual themselves, as things were quite fluid in the realms, so they'd seek boys too, but not strictly for sexual purposes. They used sex with children as tools of control, violence, humiliation, and degradation. The pedophiles and pederasts often felt that way too. They were after a child. Whether it was a boy or girl didn't matter to them. Most mortal men who molest boys are not gay. They see a boy as a projected representation of themselves. They feel themselves to be more child than adult, more boy than man, and therefore find themselves more comfortable, especially sexually, in the company of children. Most men who sexually abuse also experience heterosexual attraction to adults. The demon lords use that to their advantage, as they influence the diminished mortal men into grooming the boys, girls too of course, towards a state where they can then be demonically influenced as punishment for deviating from their culture-specific societal norms. It's a trap they're being led towards. Demons use the damned to generate more damned. The latter damned are damned through no actual fault of their own. It's just that they've strayed from the path demanded of them by weak, controlling men, who need someone to batter and put up as the cause of their society's ills. So no one realises that they are the true problem. They seek status by offering to exorcise the society they broke by providing non-heterosexual boys as penance for their own misdeeds. After all, we would not be suffering if it were not for these pansies and sodomites drawing the wrath of God upon us, they like to claim. Yet all this accomplishes is to invite the demons to run amok among them. There is no exorcising of innocence. When they are unjustly given upon the altar, it's an invocation for evil to come play. Some boys need very little grooming or none at all, but are just adjusting their attractions to their peer group, who are mostly only looking for same-sex experimentation out of curiosity and the pursuit of fast pleasure. They move towards someone who can provide less danger of exposure as a true fag. He among the group being the one enjoying the exploratory sex play a lot more than his friends, and desirous of deeper intimacy with the boys in his circle, but too scared to pursue it, and goes in search of more stable emotional bonds and broader sexual fulfillment, something which they generally only find with someone older. That can be an older boy, a male relative, a neighbour, the dirty old man they've heard rumours about and secretly spy on hoping for an encounter, a priest or pastor, a teacher, a school janitor, a coach, a man in the park, a scout leader, anyone who the boy feels are interested in him. Being cut off from finding other boys like themselves by a watchful society ready to pounce, they then turn their attractions to someone older and discreet, who shows an interest in them and is skilled at the passions they seek. Yet in the hands of such men, even the willing boys are unwittingly guided to dreadful places and practices. At times, Pooh or one of his agents will infiltrate a circle jerk as the new kid in school, just to find the special boy they need to further along on the path of corruption. Sometimes they'll whisper in their ear about the delights the dirty old man has for them, were they to show up on his doorstep one night, asking about a lost puppy, or how they should go sit naked with the men in the YMCA sauna, or how they could mow lawns shirtless to entice their customers, or suggest they take up a newspaper route and identify which subscribers are receptive to their charms, or to accept the candy, when the man in the white van pulls up beside their bicycle, or how they should volunteer at the nursing home and read to a lonely man while sharing cookies, and how they could help the elderly man with his loneliness, or how they should bat their eyes and tilt their hips while passing men on the sidewalk, or how to set real close to a man on a bus to where the boy's hand accidentally rests on his thigh, or how to find names and addresses on the sex offender registry and trick or treat them on Halloween, or how to rub their butt against Santa's groin at the mall, or where to find the private nude areas of beaches, or how to accept rides from strangers, or going behind the amusement rides where the moralless carnies are camped, or hanging out in the alleys behind adult arcades, or putting up notices on bulletin boards offering odd job services and underlining that you'll do anything to get them to deviate from normal behaviours that would open the doors to their own molestation. If you want to catch the big fish, use the right bait and throw your hook in the right waters, Pooh will tell them. Such normal behaviours or norms often forbid homosexuality, so even when manipulated or forced or even curious for intergenerational sex, the boys are considered corrupted in their culture, spoiled and evil, unworthy and unwanted. This allows the dark ones access to their minds, bodies and souls. A wounded child is a child to be ruined. In cultures that embrace non-conforming gender roles and same-sex attractions, the demon lords hold very little sway. Corrupted is a subjective term, which results in boys being thrown away and left to the mercy of darker forces. If you want to send a boy towards ruin and hand him over to dark forces, you set for him a rigid moral criteria which cannot be deviated from, lest he be considered abnormal among his kind and a threat to the strict order and conventions demanded of him. Disallowing a boy his natural inclinations, desires and path will warp them in very bad ways. Ostracised from their society, whether by hiding themselves in self-preservation or by being found out and condemned, then used as whipping boys to absolve their society of its true sins of being self-righteous and unwelcoming. They can be easily influenced into being subjugated to old men and demons, led into prostitution, hooked on drugs, reduced to doing anything in order to survive, finding themselves desirous of the mistreatment they feel they deserve, all while declining into sad states of despair, which will walk them towards suicide. Their only salvation is acceptance and the allowance to be who they were wired to be by a more enlightened culture that celebrates uniqueness, uplifts all, and seeks no profit in harming people. Such cultures have existed throughout time, but the cursed Abrahamic religions developed and began twisting beliefs in order to sacrifice their children to themselves and fill their coffers full of gold, given to them by indoctrinated followers seeking to avoid eternal flames. To them, their lust is sated by throwing their most vulnerable upon the altar of suffering and distracting themselves by laying the blame on innocence, and the demons laughed in delight. When your arms are unwelcoming, abandoned boys will seek out arms that will welcome them, even if those arms belong to predators and demons. When you throw away a child, there is an insidious force waiting in the shadows ready to catch them, and the demons laughed in delight. Candyman and 3 other demon lords had unique realms in that they found the uncommon predatory adult homosexual to pursue, corrupt and ruin homosexual boys. However, that's just a general description. There were, in fact, a wide range of gender identities and sexual orientations among the Isle's boys, just no heterosexual ones. What they were in life, they remained in death and resurrection, unless their spirits sought change, which was an uncommon event. The Candyman pursued the special ones, gay, bisexual, pansexual, queer, and however they chose to identify. There were even lesbian-identifying boys who found comfort with the trans boys. Concepts of masculinity and femininity were diverse on the Isle. Strict black and white identity roles weren't seen in the immortal worlds, especially not there. Those were typically modern mortal conventions and unknown to the ancients, who had seen such foolery come and go over the millennia. Boys came in many flavours, with some behaving as the standard concept of how a boy is expected to behave in the mortal world, with their homosexual preferences well hidden. Within the realms, you'd find butch-acting boys, gods, demons and such, right alongside with their more sissy counterparts. Even that was on a spectrum. In one boy you might find barely noticeable effete mannerisms or a lisp, But in another, you'd find a full-blown flamer like Pooh. As seen among gods, demons, monsters and humans, crossbreeding pregnancies can occur. It isn't even as rare as one would think. There are many hybrid breeds who walk among us and shadow us from the mists. Ancient tales inform us of the Greek god Zeus from the realm of Olympus and his sexual peccadillos, of how he'd change into an animal and have sex with mortals, and still does. At times, the mighty Olympian Zeus, the son of ancient ones Kronos and Rhea, would metamorph into a swan, a bull, or other animal to ravage his human prey. These couplings produced a lot of demigod offspring, including Heracles, who now trained Pooh's hyper-masculine battle boys and gave the imp an occasional romp with rough trade. Heracles came about from the mating of Zeus and Zeus's great-granddaughter Alcmene, who was mostly mortal. Demigods like demidemons and demi-monsters are the children produced by copulation between the natural and the supernatural. There are a few exceptions to that rule, in that a mortal from two mortal parents can be raised to demi-status as an honorific, such as Candyman has honoured Pooh by giving the boy expanded powers and raising him to a demi-demon and custodian of the pink mist. Zeus was also attracted to adolescent boys and young men. Most notably was Ganymede. Nearly 3,400 years ago, Ganymede was a 14-year-old Trojan prince in the Central Balkans, which is now present-day Hisarlik, Turkey. His youthful beauty bordering on the feminine was such that he was pursued by mortal women and men, as well as immortals too. Everyone wanted a piece of that action. Ganymede was the son of the mortal king Tros of Dardania, after whom Troy took its name, and Callirrhoe, the daughter of the river god Scamander, who was the son of Zeus. According to history, Zeus spotted Ganymede while the latter was attending to his father's flocks, and he became enchanted with his looks. Therefore, he took the form of an eagle and abducted Ganymede, taking him to Mount Olympus. There, Zeus elevated him to demigod status by granting him eternal youth and immortality and the office of cupbearer to the gods. However, cupbearer has a bit of a different meaning to the Olympians. Cupbearer referred to Ganymede's ass. The boy was the receptacle for the horny male gods, Zeus being the primary spurter. Thus, Zeus abducted and molested his great-grandson, meaning both Heracles and Ganymede were the byproduct of the god having sex with his mortal great-grandchildren. Zeus's and Ganymede's love affair was so popular among the Greeks that they modelled their social customs to include paiderastia, the romantic relationship between an adult male and an adolescent boy. Ganymede now resides on the Isle as a hostage and the working agent cupbearer. A long-ago conflict between the demon lords and the Greek gods resulted in Zeus surrendering his beloved boy toy Ganymede to Candyman, where he is now held as a diplomatic captive on the Isle, yet exists as any other boy there. He's still getting his cup filled too. Episode 10, Penny Ante.
Pooh requires us to record our life stories, both living and resurrected, for the archives. So here's mine. My Uncoming Part 1 by Agent Bumblebee, a.k.a. Robin Janssens, the 20th of October, 1977 Isle time. I am Agent Bumblebee. My real name is Robin Janssens. I was born on March 4th, 1962, in Garden City, Kansas, to John and Alicia Janssens. I'm of German and French descent, with both sides of my family migrating here after WO II. My grandparents were two sets of friends in Paris, who immigrated to America together. They already had children. Two ended up marrying, and then I came along and became the first one born in America. My mom was your regular small-town housewife devoted to home, church, and family. Dad worked as a lineman for the electrical co-op. On Saturdays, he and his pals would gather in the garage and drink while playing poker. Mom was a lapsed Catholic who converted to being a Baptist. She was a regular churchgoer at the First Southern Baptist Church and sang the loudest in the choir. She disapproved of my dad's drinking and gambling, but did so quietly. When I was little, I'd get invited to play with the men, but only had pennies to throw into the pot. The stakes were never high for me, so I ended up with the nickname Penny Ante. It stuck within my family and Dad's circle of friends. I had started developing an attraction towards boys when I was 9. My friend Bobby and I did the usual experimentation and then progressed into being quasi-lovers, but we had begun drifting apart. He had been isolating himself after his mom died, and I wasn't seeing much of him. When we did hang out, it usually ended with us looking through dirty books inside the treehouse we'd built in his backyard. Once things changed between us, Bobby stopped reciprocating the intimacy we'd had before. He would just lean back, point at his crotch, and let me do what I enjoyed doing to him. It was my favorite part anyway. I liked boys and girls, but mostly I liked boys. Maybe I didn't really like girls, but I did make out with a few of them. It didn't do as much for me as being with a boy did. It was complicated. I had girlfriends. 7th grade it was Bonnie, 8th grade it was Michelle, and in 9th grade I'd found myself attached to Cindy, who gave me hand jigs on the school bus when we traveled out of town to some far-off drama meet. The getting there trip was always begun at 6 a.m., so it was still dark aboard the bus, and most everyone was sleeping. There was this older boy I tried to sit behind, so that while Cindy was playing with me under my coat, I could look at the back of his pretty head and fantasize it was his hands on me. I was precocious in junior high, but I knew to be very careful, because you didn't want to get a homo rap laid on you in Garden City. I'd seen how they treated queers in this town, by how they treated the town fag, who had more than once been beaten and thrown off the Arkansas River Bridge. Thus I held my secrets close and just restricted myself to a few trusted friends. It's hard to keep secrets, though. My downfall began when I was 14. It was March 1976, 9 months before my being reaped somewhere in a bat colony in the Yucatan Peninsula. That's a wild story, but our first report is about corruption, so those other details will be addressed in my second report. So far, in the beginning of my 14th year on Earth, I'd managed to have my first drunk, lost my cherry to the old rapey town fag, and been blackmailed into being his receptacle under threat of my parents, the First Southern Baptist Church, and Garden City High School being given some Polaroids that were taken of me during the half-conscious loss of my virginity. I put up a lot of resistance, but the photos he had made it looked like I was into it. Screams looked like moans of pleasure. The poppers he made me sniff gave me a rush of ecstasy a few times, so I assume that's why I looked pleased being boogered against my will. After a couple of episodes like this with me giving up all resistance and just praying to get it over quickly, Denny, the old rapey town fag, added Polaroids of me dressed in female lingerie to the threat. I had no desire whatsoever to be beaten and thrown out of the house where my parents to see the pictures of me naked with the old hairy Sicilian town fag's dick in my mouth and ass. The photographs were damning. Thus, when he beckoned, I went to his garage apartment, stripped, and let him do what he wanted to me, not liking it at all. Denny lived across the alley from me on Fulton Street. I was giggling drunk in the middle of the night out by the trash cans. The night before had been my birthday, so after everyone went to bed, I took some vodka from the garage and hid out back in the alley to drink it. I got really tooted. That was unlike me. If you overlooked my being a bound-for-Baptist hell sodomite and a bit of a gambler, I was a really good kid. Never got into any trouble at all. Good grades, scouts, sports, church, mowed lawns, kept my room clean. Booze had no appeal to me, but something put the temptation into my mind. Something. Denny saw me by the trash cans, almost like he'd been lying in wait, and half carried me to his converted garage apartment where one thing led to another, none of it willingly. He raped me. I wasn't strong enough to fend him off, and being drunk didn't help. He laid me over one of those old cable drums some people were using as coffee tables back then, held me down with his torso in one arm, yanked my pants and tighty whities to my ankles, slicked himself up with petroleum jelly, found the spot, and went to town all within 5 minutes of me being inside his place. He kept me for 2 hours afterwards, making me do more things, including taking it in my butt again. That time I didn't resist, just cried. There was a reason. During the second boogering where I didn't resist, I heard Denny whisper to no one else in the room, "He's ours now." It was a weird thing for him to say, but I now know there was another presence in the room. Not Pooh, but one of Candyman's other minions, a demon named Dwyrg. I had to bend over and take it from him 6 more times before the month was even over. 2 of those times he blindfolded me. He'd whisper to someone, and I'd feel a dick go inside me that wasn't Denny's. The dick was bigger and was cold. Then Denny's familiar member would slide into my mouth. While I was being spit roasted, I could hear the sound of the Polaroid camera being used, but the shots Denny later showed to me only had the 2 of us in them. Again, I now know my other violator was Dwyrg, who can't show up on film. The last 2 times we were alone. He dressed me up as a girl and put makeup on my face. He said he was going to make me into a sissy. I wasn't into that. Although I liked to mess around with boys, I wasn't into that other queer stuff. I liked to camp, fish the Arkansas River, swim at the big pool in Finup Park, sneak around the buffalo at the preserve, bike around town, chase tumbleweeds, play baseball, wrestle, horseplay, climb the water tower, go to Sunday school and Bible camp, and all the regular boy stuff. I didn't like Denny, or what he was making me do. Some of it was really nasty, but it hardly drowned out my desires for others nearer my age. Denny was old, nearly 30. Somehow he'd found himself in the wave of immigrants that flooded into Garden City over the last few years. He was Sicilian, but we were getting Mexicans and Somalians in. Plus, Vietnamese were arriving after the war. The Baptists were fond of tongue-wagging about how the foreigners were bringing in their strange and immoral ways. However, I was American-born and already possessed my immoral oral ways long before the 2 Mexican and 1 Somalian boy used my mouth behind the bowling alley. Denny was the town's known homosexual, and I was its mostly unknown homosexual. Now Denny was loud and out and ready to fight over it. Didn't care what people thought. He dressed and acted sissy, hot pants and a halter top over his shaved legs and chest, makeup on his face. He could duke it out with the best of them, though. He daily endured slurs being hurled at him as he walked about town, and his garage apartment was frequently vandalized. More probably happened, but that's what I had seen out and about. Until recently, when I started hearing whispers in the halls, I only really heard gay slurs directed at me. When I was down on my knees pleasuring some boy who wanted to preserve his dignity and manhood by referencing me as faggot or queer or dick licker, while I licked his dick. I wasn't a bit sissy acting, nor did I hit on other boys, but somehow they knew I'd do things for them. It's like I put out a, "I want to suck your dick" message, regardless of how discreet I tried to be. It's like someone put an idea in their heads that they could pull me aside, and I get them off just for the asking. That ended up being Pooh's doing. I guess I was maybe by now servicing so many boys that it wouldn't be long before everyone knew I was a fag. Someone was bound to, and did, start spilling the beans. No one wanted to let anyone know what was going on and ruin their good thing, but before long one of my oral receivers would brag to a friend about getting a blowjob. Then that friend would get me alone, and then they'd tell a friend, and soon I was taking aspirin for my aching jaws. Those dudes tended to be junior varsity football players, who I'd grown up with a few from the varsity team. Older brothers and such. One friend, whose dad used to run our scout troop back in 5th grade and was the second boy I ever blew, told me I now had a queer reputation that was starting to spread, so he couldn't be seen talking to me anymore. I was starting to be avoided. I was told things had been written about me on the bathroom stalls in the boys' restroom. Robin Jansen sucks big dicks. Robin Jansen sucks black cock. Robin Jansen's is blowing his way through the football team. Robin Jansen's is a cock-sucking faggot. There was a crude drawing of a spewing rod pointed at a mouth with my name written above it. That was Pooh's doing too. It was too much. Right now, rumors about me hadn't moved outside of school, but I knew I was on a short leash. Yes, I wanted to do that stuff with some of them, but there were getting to be way too many boys knowing my secret and availing themselves of my mouth. I was in a precarious position for, were I to reject someone, they might get mad and tell everyone about me. I ended up blowing any of the high schoolers that wanted it, white, black, Mexican, didn't matter. What the girls in school weren't doing for them, I was. That was a whopping 17 boys added to the 6 friends I'd been doing for a few years. It was a small town. I was on track to blow every boy in high school were this pace to keep up. I had to service boys I'd never gotten along with growing up. That Delaney asshole now used me every time he spotted me leaving the movies. Off to the alley we'd go with his buddy Anthony waiting his turn. Right now, I could deny it all were rumors to spread outside school. But Denny had pictures. At school, all semester I had a bad case of freshman hots for a senior named Randy Heydrich. At 18, he was going to be graduating in May and I wouldn't get to see much of him. He was pretty sexy too. Tall, lithe, bubble-butted, sexy eyes and a smile that melted my heart. Plus he was nice, always smiled at me, and never brought up the gossip going around the school about me being queer. He, my hanging by a thread girlfriend, and I were in Macaulay's drama class together. I found him to be some genuine eye candy. Yes, there was some puppy love stirring inside me, but not for Cindy. I knew Randy's little brother Brian from junior high. A year ago, I was in 8th grade and Brian was a 7th grader. The two brothers were complete opposites. While Randy at 18 was 6 foot tall and had a body conditioned by track and tennis and a sweet personality, Brian at 13 was short, squat, chubby, and mean-spirited. We didn't have any core classes together, but did cross paths in band and in the auditorium. The Garden City Junior High used to be the high school. They'd built a new high school the year before, but the auditorium and gymnasium were still at what was now the junior high. There was a practice gym at the new school, but official Garden City Buffaloes basketball games and wrestling matches always ended up down at the old place. I'd attend the wrestling meets after school just to watch the sweaty high school boys grapple. I had some rare locker room treats thrown my way once most everyone had left. The big gym was in center of the block, with the 5th and 6th graders on the west end and the 7th and 8th graders on the east end. The auditorium was in the 7th and 8th grade section. My best friend Bobby had begun hanging out with Brian, but I never tagged along. That was weird to me. This year, Randy and I were in a high school production of Our Town together, so we're at the auditorium. Brian stayed after school to ride home with his brother. He sat in the balcony section to watch we high schoolers rehearse the play and was recruited to work the spotlight until Norman, the stage crew chief, got there. That happened to be the balcony where Brian and I had snuck up to last year, where I sucked him off. Brian and I had been in junior high school band together. He played the tuba and I the tenor sax. Neither of us was very good at it, so Mr. Dyer would send us from the band room to the auditorium for extra practice after school, while he focused on the ones with talent. One day, we had practiced for about 5 minutes, and then Brian suggested we go check out the balcony. I was game, so followed him up the narrow stairs. As soon as we stepped into the unlit seating area, he pulled his dick out and started playing with it. He said Bobby had told him I was a real good cocksucker. My best friend had been reckless about our secret. Bobby had not been the same since that weird pink mist drifted into the meatpacking plant and caused the accidental death of his mother, Pamela, when she walked into an industrial bone saw while trying to find her way through the mist. Of course, I now know that it was Pooh who orchestrated Pamela's death. He'd later tell me he needed to isolate me from my one true confidant and the friend who always had my back. Had my best friend been there on the night of my birthday, he would have slept over and Denny would have never happened. Plus, no one messed with Bobby. He was the toughest kid in town. He would have controlled what was happening to me at school. Bobby and I had been best friends since the age of 5 and started messing around when we were 9. His grandpa Bob liked to sit us on his lap and touch us in places. Neither Bobby nor I cared for that, but the man gave us treats and comics and then had Bobby and I touch each other. We liked that part. It took Brian about half a minute to convince me to get down on my knees and suck on him. After that, whenever Mr. Dyer sent us away to practice, we'd head directly to the balcony, and I'd get on my knees to blow the 7th grader's small cock until he popped one. It was the only instrument I was good at playing. After the Our Town rehearsal, I saw Brian whispering into Randy's ear. The older brother looked my way, nodded his head yes at Brian, and they walked over to me. "Hey buddy, we're going back roading. Do you want to ride with us?" Randy asked. I said, "Sure, sounds like fun." All 3 of us walked to the school parking lot towards Randy's old, rugged 1960 Pontiac Safari station wagon. Brian said to ride in the back seat with him, so that's where I climbed in. As we headed north out of town, Brian unbuckled his belt and tugged his pants and underwear down to his ankles. "Get at it, faggot," he ordered me. At this point, I wasn't sure what to do. Brian noticed my hesitation, so put his hand behind my head and forced my mouth down on him. Here I was in the station wagon cruising down Route 83 with the boy of my dreams driving and was nursing his little brother in the back seat. I figured what the heck, if Randy was concerned about it, then he'd already be saying something. It had to have been prearranged between the brothers anyway. This could be my chance to get to Randy's goodies. As I sank deeper on his member, I noticed it had grown a lot in length since I was last with him, as had his belly. I had to use the right side of my face to push his stomach up and away from his crotch, so I'd have full access. He was moaning and telling Randy that I was even a better sucker than he'd remembered. After 7 months in high school, not to mention Denny, my oral skills had been perfected. Okay, I liked the taste of a dick in my mouth. It might seem strange, but every gay boy understands what I'm talking about. I unconsciously emitted a mmm, which had them both laughing. "Oh, you love it, don't you, fairy?" teased Brian. With my lips firmly attached to his heated pole, I let out another muffled mmm, thereby fully admitting to my oral fixation. We were now out in the country, headed straight up James Fulton Hill. There wasn't much left of the road, though. Chunks of it had washed out years ago and was never repaired. Randy's safari station wagon was on an actual safari. I stopped working on Brian at this point. It was going to be a very rough ride to the top of that hill, and I didn't want to bite his dick off when Randy hit one of the 50 holes he was about to encounter. The station wagon finally came to a stop. We were parked at the very top of the sole hill overlooking the flat valley. The top of the isolated hill was spread out and flattened. The old, long-abandoned Fulton house was centered in the middle of a grove of stunted cedar trees. Not much grew around Garden City. Lots of sagebrush, though. The journey up the hill was so rattling by vehicle that hardly anyone came up here anymore. It was March, so still a little cool out, but Brian and I were heated up. We all got out of the station wagon and Randy went around to the rear to open up the hatch, as Brian hopped with his pants down around his ankles, putting the back seats down. Keep in mind, this was back in the days when the cars were huge, and if the seats were down in a station wagon, there was almost a full-size bed area back there. Randy grabbed a few blankets that were in the back and rolled them out like a bed. Brian told Randy to start getting undressed. It was pretty much a demand. The 18-year-old didn't hesitate and quickly took his clothes off. I watched him intently as he bared his beautiful lithe body and felt my dick throbbing and leaking inside my underwear. When he pulled off his tiny black lace panties, that was a surprise. The sweetest ass at GCHS was right in my face. There was small lettering centered right above his butt crack, but I couldn't make out what it said, as Randy moved away from me. Brian scooted onto the makeshift bed from a passenger door. He'd pulled off his shirt and shoes and stepped out of his pants, so was now fully naked. He looked at me and ordered me to strip, but I was already doing so. I knew a threesome starting when I saw one, so I didn't need instructions. As I stripped off my own black lace panties, which Denny was now forcing me to wear every day, I saw the front was soaked from my dick drooling over my anticipation. "Whoa, stop!" Brian yelled. I froze, not knowing what was up. "Come here and turn around," he demanded, while motioning Randy over to look at my ass. Denny had been taking a black permanent marker and keeping a tally on my ass cheeks, dating his anal conquests. Baby bitch fucked by Denny on March 5th. 76 March 7th. 76 March 8th. 76 plus Dweerg March 9th. 76 March 13th. 76 plus Dweerg March 21st. 76 March 22nd. 76. Well, Denny told me he had a new bitch. He didn't tell me it was you though, Penny Auntie, Brian said. To my shame, Randy and Brian now both knew I'd been getting plowed regularly by the town fag. Imagine how low in status the town fag was. Now imagine how low in status the town fag's bitch was. What they didn't know was that there were 9 pennies in the left back pocket of my jeans, representing the 7 times Denny had penetrated me, and the 2 times he had a partner use me. The old town fag taunted me by saying that all my pockets would soon be full of pennies. The black lettering would fade, but Denny would just trace back over it to keep it fresh looking. The 22nd was last night, so there was no fade. My shame was freshly recorded. Red-faced, I joined the brothers in the station wagon, noticing we were all at full mast. I started going down on Brian again, with plans to switch over to Randy after a minute. Being embarrassed was not about to ruin my shot with Randy. Brian motioned at Randy, who immediately laid next to his little brother with their nude bodies touching. I was on my hands and knees between Brian's legs, but switched around to where one of my knees was between the young brother's short, chubby legs, while the other was between Randy's long, lean legs. Brian guided my head over to Randy's privates, at last, where I started suckling like a starving baby. I was now going down on both the Heydrich brothers. It wasn't long before I noticed the brothers were kissing. Pulling out of my mouth after a few minutes, Dreamy said he wanted to fuck me, so I got into position as fast as I could. Brian tried to maneuver in, but even the big station wagon wasn't going to have enough room for us all to move around freely. We got out and Randy moved the blankets to the ground and had me get right back into position. My ass was up in the air and my dream had come true with the heartthrob now deep inside me. Brian walked around and fed his dick to Randy. It was clear to me that they had lots of practice with each other. As the older Heydrich pumped inside me, the younger Heydrich had gotten behind him. When I felt Randy fall against my back and groan, I knew that Brian had thrust deeply into him. It seemed Randy was serving a passive role too. It sure looked like he showed obedience to his kid brother. I was in a dom-sub relationship with Denny, so I knew the signs between those two. When Randy turned around and bent down to grab his clothes, his ass was just inches from my face. I got a good look this time at the crude lettering above his crack. It wasn't professionally done and it was small, but it was definitely a permanent ink tattoo. Juan Bryan's pussy. Juan, that fat little junior high boy, had made the hottest senior in Garden City High School history, who happened to be his adult brother, into his own personal toy, just like Denny had done to me.
Gregor Laimler's sojourn in Paris during September 1940 was a waste of time. His reports to Reinhard Heydrich complained of his being hamstrung by the rivalry between the Wehrmacht and the Gestapo. The former claimed exclusive control of the occupied territories on Hitler's behalf. The latter had made a semi-clandestine entry into the French capital. Berlin replied in vague terms. Laimler understood. Operation Schadelbearer had already been pursuing its unproductive course for almost 6 years, so Heydrich would prefer him to be discreet to the point of invisibility. He was nonetheless to be assigned an office at 11 Rue des Saussayes, and a staff of 10. More to the point, he was to have all the French money he wanted, or almost all, because the Vichy government was making such astronomical monthly payments to the occupying power that no one knew what to do with them. Episode 11. Turning Timmy. As the weather started warming up nearing the end of April 2023, Timmy, like most boys his age, which was 14, loved to jerk off outdoors. It was a rite of passage. There was something about being outside and the feel of the sun on your skin that makes them want to unleash their hormones and get back to nature. Timmy had just gotten in from school and had lots of time before his mum and dad got home. He had rushed home anticipating a special delivery, and sure enough, the box sat on the front porch waiting for him. Taking it into the house, he went into his bedroom and opened up the package. From that, he pulled out a large dildo that he'd gotten in that morning from Amazon. Unknown to most parents, or maybe they knew and didn't care, while they were at work, sex toys from Amazon were filling the bedrooms of horny kids all over the country, courtesy of those birthday gift cards from Grandma. Yesterday, the teen had used his iPhone to browse around the company website, found what he wanted, clicked Buy Now, paid the $29.95, all while eating lunch in the school cafeteria. That morning, the driver dropped off the Doc Johnson uncut 8 lifelike black silicone vibrating and thrusting anal stimulator with 5 variable thrusting speeds, textured veins for realistic feel, suction cup base for hands-free play. His parents were none the wiser. Grabbing the dildo, Timmy headed back outside, peeled off his school shirt and pulled down his tight nylon school trousers and underwear. Spreading a towel on the patio, Timmy lay down on his back, feeling the sun warm his lean body. With one hand, he stroked his himself. After a long day of school, it felt really good. He had other toys, so wasn't a toy virgin, but this was going to be the biggest one yet. Throwing back his legs, he brought the dildo down between his cheeks and let the variable thrusting action do its job. He thought about what it must be like to be entered for real. He imagined the dildo was Rashawn, the hot black school janitor at Thomas Jefferson High School in Richmond. The day before, Rashawn had stood next to Timmy at the urinals. Timmy got a good long look as the janitor shook the droplets off his dick. It was that sight that had Timmy rushing to the cafeteria, looking online for something as close to Rashawn as he could get. He found a really good facsimile with variable thrusting action. Sitting in school the following day, Timmy thought about how good the dildo had felt inside him and planned more time to play when he got home. All the way there on the school bus, Timmy's thoughts were about his dildo, which he had named Rashawn. Timmy was so focused on having some alone time with Rashawn that as he walked up the driveway, he almost didn't hear Mr. Johnson shout out to him. "Sorry, Mr. Johnson, I didn't hear you. What did you say?" he asked. A professional photographer, Mr. Johnson was a wiry white man, about 45, bearded and short, ugly and uncaring about personal hygiene. He'd once played high school baseball with Timmy's dad and occasionally came over to Timmy's house to watch a game and have a beer. The teen boy did his best to avoid the man, who was always pressuring him to pose for photos. "I said, please come over here so we can talk, Timmy. It's important." Timmy was puzzled and aching to get with toy Rashawn, but he grudgingly followed Mr. Johnson into his house all the same. "There's something I want to show you," Mr. Johnson explained, leading the boy into the lounge. Turning on the TV, he pressed a button on the remote control and a video file popped up on the screen. The footage was clearly from a security camera. The scene was in black and white, looking down from above on part of Mr. Johnson's backyard, but also over the fence into Timmy's yard. Timmy felt a sick feeling in his stomach as he noticed the date stamp in the corner, yesterday's date. "I had the cameras installed last week," the man explained. Timmy watched helplessly as he saw himself enter the picture and start to remove his clothes. "Please, Mr. Johnson, turn it off. It's not what you think. I can explain." On the screen, a smiling Timmy brought the big black dildo to his arse. "I think I know all I need to know, Timmy. You're clearly a little faggot. Now what do you think your dad is going to think when he sees his precious teenage son fucking himself with a dildo, a black one?" "Please don't tell my dad. I'm not a faggot. Really, I'm not." "Your dad really hates fags and blacks, doesn't he? I bet he'd throw you out for sure." On the screen, the black dildo was fully embedded in Timmy's arse. He was clearly moaning in pleasure as it thrust inside him. Even worse, the security camera had audio. You could hear Timmy begging Rashawn to fuck him with his big black dick. His dad was very racist and homophobic. Never a day passed when Timmy didn't have to block out the hurtful words coming from his mouth that applied to him and the type of person he was attracted to. He was queer for blacks, a jack of spades, a snow bunny, a big black cock lover, a white boy wanting to submit to much older black men. And even though those were only ever fantasies and never actually lived out, he'd be his dad's worst nightmare. All Timmy really wanted in life was a black boyfriend around his age, someone to hang out with, hold hands and kiss and cuddle. The rest, as it is with most people, were just fantasies to fuel oneself to an orgasm, natural needs satisfied with just a dose of naughtiness. "Please don't show my dad that video. Please," the boy pleaded through tears. "I think your dad would want to know about this. I really think I should tell him. Please, Mr. Johnson, I'll do anything, just please don't tell him. Do you really mean that, Timmy? You'll do anything, whatever I ask." "Oh, yes, I promise, anything at all," cried Timmy, suddenly seeing a ray of hope. Poor Timmy was much too naive to realise what he was agreeing to. He didn't understand the perverted things which some depraved men like to do to boys like him. He couldn't foresee how those words were going to totally change the rest of his life. Timmy's fate was sealed. Not only did he have to pleasure Mr. Johnson and his friends, none of them who he was the least big attracted to, by summer, photos and videos of those acts had been posted on Gay Boy Hub, and he was doing live sex shows on Only Boys. Neither company went out of their way to assure the models and performers weren't non-consenting children. A week before he was to begin his sophomore year at high school, the day after Mr. Johnson had prostituted him out to an elderly man, Timmy went into his parents' bedroom, took a 9mm revolver from the bedside table, stuck the barrel in his mouth, and blew his head off. "Welcome to the academy, Timmy. Here and for now you will be known as Trainee Cupcake. Come, I'll introduce you to the other boys and give you a tour of the aisle before sending you off to the barracks for processing." And this concludes Madness of Pooh. Book 1, The Boy in the Pink Mist. Look for Book 2, Possession, coming soon.